uses in the arts, recreation, and entertainment services indoor category, including an art gallery, artist studio, fitness and recreational sports center, personal instruction studio, and a professional studio. General office and dental medical offices would also be allowed. This limited range of commercial uses is more restrictive than a standard mixed use or Main Street district in the urban neighborhood context. To facilitate reuse, the PUD acknowledges the current conditions of the subject property and includes custom standards for the existing building, as well as vehicular parking and landscaping. Throughout the rezoning process, application notifications have been provided according to code requirements, and the LUDI meeting is scheduled for June 21st. To date, staff has received 2 letters and 1 presentation from nearby homeowners opposed to the rezoning as they question the need for new commercial uses to be allowed in the former church building. Staff has also received 10 support letters advocating for reuse of the former church by the limited commercial uses proposed. As described in the applicant's narrative, they conducted extensive public outreach with the West Washington Park Neighborhood Association beginning in May of 2020. The applicant also met with adjacent neighbors on several occasions to discuss a potential PUD and the types of uses that might be allowed in the former church building. Moving on to the Denver Zoning Code review criteria, it must be found that the requested map amendment is consistent with 5 criteria. In regard to criteria 1, there are 3 adopted plans that apply to the requested rezoning, including the Comp Plan 2040, Blueprint Denver, and the West Washington Park Neighborhood Plan. As stated in the staff report, the rezoning is consistent with several goals in the comprehensive plan. A few of those goals relate to improving access to healthcare and the arts and supporting the reuse of existing buildings and neighborhood serving businesses. The rezoning request is also consistent with Blueprint Denver. The subject property is mapped as part of the urban neighborhood context, which is described as containing small multi-unit residential and low-intensity mixed-use buildings embedded in single-unit and 2-unit residential areas with good walkability. The rezoning request is also consistent with the future place type defined by Blueprint Denver, as the subject property is designated as residential low, which is typically characterized by single unit uses with buildings up to 2.5 stories. However, the residential low place type also states that vacant institutional uses, such as churches, may be appropriate for additional development intensity. As for the future street type defined in Blueprint, both South Pearl Street and East Tennessee Avenue are categorized as local or undesignated streets, which can vary in their land uses and are found in all neighborhood contexts. With regard to the city's growth strategy, Blueprint Denver directs growth to key centers, corridors, and high-density residential areas that align with transportation options, while limited growth is desired in all other areas of the city, specifically 10% of jobs and 20% of housing by 2040. The proposed map amendment is consistent with this growth area, as it will facilitate a few new employment opportunities in proximity to the interstate and light rail. Furthermore, the proposed rezoning helps implement 2 Blueprint Denver policies related to land use and build form. First, the plan encourages compatible redevelopment of institutional sites within neighborhoods, and it says that until a citywide approach is implemented, individual rezonings are appropriate. Secondly, the plan seeks to preserve structures that contribute to an area's established character, even if such structures are not historic landmarks. Blueprint Denver also recommends against using custom zoning tools like PUDs, except when unique or extraordinary circumstances exist. While a standard mixed use or Main Street zone district, such as UMX 2X or UMS 2X, would also facilitate reuse of the former church, the full range of uses allowed in those districts could result in a higher intensity use than would be appropriate on a local street adjacent to single unit and 2-unit residences. In addition, rezoning to the UMX 2X or UMS 2X districts would allow for the redevelopment of the site within the general or shopfront building forms, which could be less compatible with the surrounding residential character. Whereas the PUD either allows for reuse of the existing building or redevelopment within the urban house building form. Moving on to the West Washington Park Neighborhood Plan. This plan was approved in 1991 and is significantly out of sync with the current Denver zoning code, which was updated in 2010. While the plan's recommendations don't clearly address the subject property, the plan does say that churches and other public facilities are integrated well into the neighborhood's residential fabric, and that all historic and architecturally significant structures should be maintained. Built in 1960, the former church on the subject property could be considered historic, although it isn't a designated landmark. Staff has determined the proposed PUD is consistent with the intent of the neighborhood plan. The rezoning is also consistent with criteria 2, 3, and 5 as stated in the staff report. In regard to criteria 4, changing conditions in the city and a city adopted plan are the most applicable justifying circumstances for this rezoning. In this case, the rezoning is justified as the changing conditions affecting this particular area and the city generally reflect a national trend of declining congregations and closing churches. Blueprint Denver further justifies the rezoning with its policies related to the reuse of vacant institutional uses and the preservation of buildings that contribute to neighborhood character. Besides the previous review criteria that apply to all map amendments, PUD rezonings must also comply with 5 additional criteria, which I'll go through. The first PUD criteria requires rezonings meet the intent and purpose of PUD districts. And PUD G29 meets this criteria because the subject site containing a former church presents a unique opportunity to reuse a longstanding non-residential building embedded in a residential neighborhood. The PUD represents a thoughtful expansion of allowable uses that are more sensitive and less impactful than rezoning to a standard mixed use or Main Street zone district, which would allow a much broader range of uses such as eating and drinking establishments, food sales, and outdoor retail sales that would likely operate for longer hours, contribute more noise, and generate more traffic than the uses proposed in the PUD. In addition, as mentioned, PUD G29 is limited to reuse of the existing building or redevelopment within the urban house building form applicable to the existing USUB zone district. In contrast, rezoning to a mixed use or Main Street district within the urban neighborhood context would allow for the general or shopfront building forms. The first PUD criteria also requires rezonings be consistent with the applicable neighborhood context, and to this end, PUD G29 is consistent with the urban neighborhood context and character and is not a vehicle to enhance the proposed development's economic feasibility. The PUD also provides several public benefits, including the diversification of land uses, more efficient use of land and energy, and development patterns compatible in character and design with nearby areas and the goals and objectives of the comprehensive plan. The PUD also complies with all standards and criteria stated in Division 9.6, as the PUD district is necessary because there is no standard zone district available that is specifically intended to allow reuse of this particular vacant institutional site in a manner that is most compatible with surrounding residential uses. Finally, PUDs are intended to be compatible with existing buildings. As the PUD is intended to facilitate reuse of the existing structure on the zone lot, the PUD doesn't prescribe a building form, but rather defines key building forms related to the existing building, including a 2-story maximum height, surface parking allowed between the building and the primary and side streets, and minimum street level transparency on the primary and side streets that matches current conditions. The existing building, established in 1960, is already compatible with adjacent residential buildings that vary in height from 1 to 2 stories. While the location of surface parking between the building and the primary street would not be allowed in a building form associated with a mixed use or Main Street district as defined today, and the existing street level transparency on the primary street is less than the general and shopfront building forms, the PUD necessarily defaults to existing conditions to ensure feasible reuse without costly modifications. The PUD also allows exemptions from current landscaping standards around existing surface parking that, if required, could significantly reduce the vehicular parking spaces provided on site. Most importantly, the standards embodied in the PUD acknowledge the time and place that the existing building was established, appreciates its longstanding history and compatibility in the immediate area, and seek to enable its longevity while avoiding significant reconstruction. Based on finding that all review criteria have been met, CPD recommends approval of the rezoning application. And the applicant's representative, Peter Wall, would also like to speak for a few minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite up Peter Wall. As the applicant, you'll have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. Appreciate everyone's time this afternoon. As Libby mentioned, my name is Peter Wall, and my address for the record is 142 South Jackson Street in Denver, here on behalf of the property owner, Leon Farfel, who owns 1001 and 1003 South Pearl Street. We'll try to make my comments as brief as possible. I think Libby did a great job of summarizing the rezoning request before you today. Before I get started, would love to take the opportunity to just thank a few individuals throughout this process. First, would like to thank Corey Keaton Pope, Sarah McCarthy, and Gertie Grant for all their time engaging with us on behalf of the neighborhood for the last 2+ years and helping to shape the PUD that's before you today. Would also like to take a moment to thank CPD staff. I know they spent a significant amount of time reviewing this, and Libby in particular for her thoughtful staff report and all of her work and lots of back and forth with me on this application. I want to take a moment and touch upon really 3 core principles for us that embody this rezoning request. And the first of which is preservation. Obviously our city, has and will continue to see and experience lots of significant growth. And when I started working with Leon, we set out working on this rezoning. Really the main goal was to come up with a creative way to incentivize adaptive reuse of this unique building that's been in the neighborhood for over 60 years. And certainly Leon could have, as the property owner, sold to another residential developer who could have built one very large or 2 single-family homes, and that scenario is happening all over Wash Park and frankly all over Denver. But in speaking with Leon, it was really his goal to save this piece of history in the neighborhood, reactivate it with uses that could benefit the area. The second principle is maintaining character and community engagement. And shortly after Leon purchased the property back in 2019, Leon reached out to the West Wash Park Neighborhood Association to introduce himself and start a dialogue on how to use this property, and then asked for my assistance to continue those discussions with adjacent neighbors and the RNO. As Libby mentioned, we could have simply pursued maybe a typical Main Street zone district, which is found in the area, but he wanted to be a good neighbor, and we thought creating a PUD with a highly negotiated use list that would provide predictability to those near the property would be an important goal. And this goal led to our community engagement efforts. And I say the word engagement very deliberately, and especially versus the word outreach. Because instead of telling neighbors, here are our plans, here's what we're going to do, we really thoughtfully engaged with them and came up with a very narrowed down use list that would promote adaptive reuse, limit impacts such as traffic and parking, and maintain character, as Libby noted, by incentivizing the preservation of the existing church building. And finally, our third principle was thoughtful urban planning and environmental stewardship. I think one of the big hallmarks of Denver's most vibrant neighborhoods and many of the greatest cities out there is walkability. And Denver's adopted plans, most recently, the adopted ones, call out the importance of promoting complete neighborhoods that are residential in nature, but provide residents with walkable amenities that meet their needs while removing our reliance on cars. And we believe this PUD maintains that neighborhood character and actually seeks to minimize impacts versus a previous or future church use while promoting a more walkable neighborhood with neighborhood serving commercial uses. And I think finally, by preserving the existing building, we're seeking to minimize our carbon emissions that a new building would generate. And yes, while this is just one site and one rezoning, I do think it's important for each of us to play our part, and that each rezoning or development consider these environmental implications given where we're at, and utilize these smart urban planning principles to address the environmental goals identified in our adopted plans. Certainly available for questions, but wanted to thank staff, again, the community and the planning board for your consideration today. I know you folks spend a great deal of time as volunteers reviewing and thoughtfully considering these proposals multiple times a month. And just know that we appreciate your time and consideration, and would respectfully request your support today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 9 people signed up to speak today on this topic. Each will have 3 minutes. If I can ask you to start with your name and address for the record. I will call out the first 3 speakers so you know what order you're coming in, and then before we're done with the first 3, I'll call out the next 3. First 3 will be Greg Holm, Linnea Hanson, and Joe Goodman. I'll just give a moment for staff to allow each of you to unmute. See if Greg Holm, you should be ready to go.
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I am a resident of the West Washington Park neighborhood. I live at 1325 South Downing. And I support this rezoning request because adding small commercial spaces to the neighborhood is crucial for West Wash Park to become a more walkable neighborhood. And for me, that definition of walkable means that residents are able to walk to meet the majority of their daily needs, including ideally to their place of employment. By granting this rezoning request, the city will allow the developer to create several small office spaces where a doctor, a dentist, therapist, insurance agent, etc., can operate businesses that allow residents to access services by walking or biking. In addition, these businesses will provide employment opportunities, which could potentially be filled by West Wash Park residents. This type of commercial is an amenity that will make West Wash Park a better place to live for all its residents. It's also a great adaptive reuse of an existing building. As other people have stated, over the last 2 years, the applicant has provided information to and responded to input from adjacent neighbors. During that time, the applicant has listened to the community and has come up with a narrow list of low-intensity commercial uses to add on top of the existing USUB zoning. As stated above, I'm a proponent of walkable neighborhoods, and I strongly believe the uses proposed for the project will benefit the West Wash Park community and will increase the vibrancy of the area. As also been stated, it's consistent with Blueprint Denver and the city's comprehensive plan. And so I'm asking that the planning board approve this rezoning request. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Next, Linnea Hanson.
Hello. Oh, wrong account. I am not Silverstone Fine Cannabis. Linnea Hanson. I reside in the West Wash Park neighborhood at 1275 South Corona Street, and am a neighbor of this proposed rezoning, and I'm asking for you to support it. I don't want to be overly repetitive. I think Ms. Kaiser's staff report was amazing and very well done. Congratulations and thank you. I do want to hit on a couple of things about how this developer dealt with the neighbors and how much time and effort they put into really hearing, especially from the people who live even more close in than I do, in order to make sure that this project worked. Adaptive reuse is so important as we see so many buildings around us being torn down and started over again. Mr. Wall was correct. The environmental impact of that is significant. But also building a neighborhood in which we all can live and walk and enjoy and be able to see a dentist or our doctor close in is really important to why I moved into West Wash Park. So I want to thank you and ask you for your support of this adaptive reuse, which meets all of the guidelines that Ms. Kaiser went through. I also appreciate her pointing out how old our neighborhood plan is. I'm sure there's a few others on this call who are working on getting that updated. But thank you, and please support this rezoning.
Thank you very much. Next will be Joe Goodman, followed by Sarah Uran, Kane Coons, and Catherine Fontaine. My apologies for all the names I'm due to mispronounce. I look forward to hearing how to pronounce them correctly. Joe Goodman.
Thank you, Joel. My name is Joe Goodman, and my wife and our family own and reside at the property at 1000 South Pennsylvania Street, directly across the alley to the west of the property. I've previously voiced my opposition in a letter dated March 22nd, but we have owned and resided at this property over 16 years. None of the residents that live in the immediately surrounding area are in favor of this rezoning. In fact, everyone I've personally spoken to categorically believes that allowing for additional commercial uses of this specific property will in no way enhance or improve the neighborhood or community. And there are a few inconsistencies to the staff report that I would like to point out today. I wasn't given a copy of the updated report, but the one that was dated May 25th is the one I'd like to point out these inconsistencies. Number one, the staff report states that the former church no longer functions as a congregation, and Ms. Kaiser mentioned it was even vacant. That is not accurate. There is a Pentecostal congregation that holds regular Sunday services at the location and also meets multiple other times throughout the week. It is unclear as to why the seller and Mr. Wall are trying to characterize the building as a former church, while there is still an active congregation gathering and worshiping there on a regular basis. Number two, the staff report characterizes one letter and one presentation as a minimal amount of opposition from nearby homeowners. I assure you this is not the case. Despite the described extensive public outreach and public engagement, I was not even really made aware of the full scope of the application until I was introduced to Mr. Wall in March of this year. Even up to a day ago, many of the immediate surrounding neighbors have told me they were not informed, not provided a full understanding of the application, the intent of the rezoning, or the process. To my knowledge, there were two primary neighbors consulted, one that is not in favor of the rezoning, and the other one sold their property and moved out of the neighborhood. Number three, the report also states the staff has received 3 support letters advocating, and I would just like it noted for the record that those support letters were from an investment banker, a commercial realtor, and a broker associate. So it's unclear what specific interest they have, but you can make your own conclusions. With all due respect, we urge the council to turn down and deny the application. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Sarah Uran.
Hi, my name is Sarah. You were pretty okay on the pronunciations, but it's you ran down the street. So I similarly to Joe, I live right next door. I just purchased the property at 1004 South Pennsylvania, directly behind the discussed property. So I've been trying to get up to speed on everything, and I apologize for not being as well versed as some of the other people. However, it's, in my personal opinion, this is absolute insanity, and I'm very, very frustrated by it. It's easy for people who live up at the park or 5 or 6 blocks away to say this is a great idea. Well, it's a great idea if it's not interfering with your garage, your dogs, your kids, your friends coming over, anything of that nature. It's very easy to vouch for it. I'd also like to point out the level of vacancy of storefronts on South Pearl Street currently, and how that isn't enough retail space for everybody who's advocating for this to go through. There's plenty of retail space. I'd also like to point out another thing is there's retail space on Mississippi. And now that they have re-rented the building on the far corner of Bucktown and Mississippi for a construction company, the trucks in that area or the employees of that company, they are now parking illegally, covering the sidewalk, which is really inconvenient, walking with two dogs and trying to swerve into Bucktail without getting hit by a car. So I'd like to say that the responsibility and the irresponsibility of people who use retail space is really, really dangerous to the neighborhood. I would argue that we see that with even Orange Theory down the street. And for me, it is just absolutely unnecessary to have more commercial space when we could just use that as residential. And I would like to back Joe up. Every Sunday there is service going on. It is not a former church. It is 100% operating. And I'm just, I'm as a new homeowner to this location, I've lived in West Wash Park for quite a while. But honestly, like this is completely and totally unnecessary. And I think all the rationales are absolutely ridiculous, but I really don't want to be told by people who don't live directly behind it or directly across from it or directly next to it that this is a good idea. And that's all I wanted to say with my time.
Thank you very much. Next, Kane Coons. And you should be able to unmute.
Sorry about that. This is Kane Coons. I live directly on the other side of the park on Tennessee, a block away from the South Gaylord Strip. So I've seen what a commercial vibrant, the goal that they're trying to achieve. I've seen that be realized, and it seems like that's, it's something that you can't just have a few commercial places in there. And there are vacancies on South Gaylord all the time, and it's still a really thriving sort of place. And if it reverts to a single family use sort of thing, the only thing that's going to happen is that it's going to be congested with a bunch of construction crews who try to, first they're going to have to scrape it and suck out even more of the character from the city I grew up in. So just, can we keep some of the existing structures? There's on a block on either side of this subject is a raging dive bar, notorious for being like pretty rowdy. So it's, why shouldn't a dentist be able to operate in between them? It seems like there might be some more local objection. And if more of those people are on this call, I guess that should be considered. But it doesn't seem like too many people wrote demonstrating support. So I also urge everyone to consider secondhand accounts as being hearsay, because I don't think anyone wants to hear, everyone that I've talked to, everyone believes me, everyone agrees with me. We all have the right to be here and to raise our concern. So I'd just suggest everybody just speak only for themselves, and I'll yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Next, we have Catherine Fontaine, followed by William Steck, Ben Berman, and Corey Pope. If I haven't called your name, we didn't have you signed up to speak on this item, but if you'd like to, you can use the raise hand feature and we'll add you to the queue. Catherine Fontaine.
Quickly, is it possible to share my screen?
We're not doing that for participants right now, but hopefully that's not a hardship. You could describe what you'd like us to know.
Okay, I will do my best. I only have 3 minutes, so I'd love to thank everyone. I don't have time. My name is Catherine Fontaine. I live at 1025 South Pearl Street. My husband and I have owned and resided at this property for 23 years and raised our children here. To add some context, we lived here through the planning and construction of the light rail system, the change of the bulk claim ordinance, all the scrape-offs for duplexes before there was rezoning, and the development of flat homes. And just an overview of this block, the 1000 block of South Pearl is unique because it is at the very edge of the West Wash Park residential neighborhood. It's adjacent to and shares the block with substantial commercial development within one block or two short east-west blocks. There is a Whole Foods grocery store, a liquor store, a coffee shop, 2 bars, 4 gyms, 2 barber shops, 2 hair salons, a nail salon, a chiropractor, a day spa, an auto mechanic, multiple office spaces, a marijuana dispensary, a dentist, an industrial space, and multiple vacant spaces, at least one of which has been vacant for nearly the entire 23 years that we have lived here. The message there is we have enough commercial. We do not want more on this block. I'd also like to note that everyone keeps talking about this building like it's some precious thing that was built in the 60s. It was extensively remodeled in the 2000s with the second floor residence that was built over the community space. I wish you could see this picture of what I see from my backyard, where this ugly side of the building looms over my backyard. So my main point here too is what is desperately needed here is not commercial space, it is single family housing. The home across the street just sold for $2 million, to give you some perspective. My other point I'd like to make is there needs to be an off-ramp. Developer has proposed to allow only a handful of uses if this is approved. And what if this experiment fails? The property owner is unable to find a tenant. Are we stuck with this vacant property in perpetuity? Are we going to be bombarded with rezoning applications every year or two requesting slightly more objectionable uses every single time? So I would say that there should be a condition if it's vacant for more than say 18 months, it should be demolished. It's a failure. And the developer should have to submit a financial surety or some form of commitment or bond to make sure that it is demolished so that it can be redeveloped as single family use. Got through in 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. William Steck.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. William Stack, for the record, my address is 272 South Ogden Street. I want to be super respectful of everybody's time and opinions here. I fully support the rezoning. I find that adding walkability, adding these multi-use commercial units to these neighborhoods add a certain character and value to have walkable amenities within reach of your home. I understand everyone's concern and trepidation, but I think keeping the current structural value of a historic building, renovated recently or not, is really important as we move in a direction in building in Denver that is mainly, prefab townhomes that all look the same, which I believe actually detracts from the overall curb appeal, if you will, of the neighborhood. And so repurposing a space that is currently maybe in use one day out of the week, I wouldn't call that fully in use, would be a really big benefit to the neighborhood and to its residents in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Ben Berman.
Hi, hey, my name is Ben Berman, and I live at 1027 South Pearl. And I wasn't really planning on talking, but I did sign up for the ability to. So I just would like to say that I oppose the change in zoning. I know that, I live on the same block, and we do have plenty of commercial, including vacant units. It doesn't seem like we need more commercial in this area. I think sticking with the residential zoning would be good. And there's really no parking on Pearl Street. I know that this particular church has a parking lot, but people, especially on Sundays when they do have their church services, park all up and down the block. And then also, it seems like the people chiming in for it don't live anywhere near here, and I highly doubt they're going to be walking over here across Alameda and down the way. But I mean, I'm not sure of that, but it's probably likely that they would go to a closer dentist on the other side of Alameda. And that's all that I have to say. I oppose it. Thank you.
Thank you. The last person we have signed up to speak is Corey Pope. So again, if you've come to speak and I haven't called your name, please use the raise hand feature and we'll add you to the list. Corey Pope.
Hi, thank you. This is Corey Pope. I am the neighbor who Peter mentioned earlier, who lives immediately north of the church across the street. That was my house that you saw in the picture that Libby presented on the slide with the little free library in the front yard. I have given hours of my life to this process with Peter and Leon and all the other parties involved over the last 2.5 years. I have been involved in these conversations since before Peter was even involved in this process, working directly with the owner, Leon. I want to reiterate a couple of things that people said earlier on the call. I agree that there's already an awful lot of commercial space, including on this very block, some of it which I would consider to be blight. There are vacant buildings with busted out windows on the very south end of the exact same block that we're talking about. My personal opinion is that we don't need more empty commercial space in this neighborhood or on this block. I would also reiterate something a previous spokesperson said about this not being a historic building. This is not a beautiful historic building that everybody feels passionate about saving, not at all. In fact, I'd argue that it's not even a beautiful building. That said, we quite like having a church across the street. There are definitely services in that church. There are people who visit that church for community events, and our family has lived here for 15 years, and we like living across the street from a church. I've worked closely with Peter and team over the past 2.5 years to get the rezoning and the PUD to a place where I can live with it. When Leon first bought this property, he approached the immediate neighbors and he was fully intent on completely rezoning it with the maximum possible uses. The neighbors pushed back hard. That's when Peter was brought into the process, and that's when I became more involved in working with Peter and Libby and Jolan Clark and all of the involved people over the past 2.5 years to narrow the use cases of the property and get it to a place where we can live with it. But I still don't really understand why we need more commercial space in this neighborhood. I know that Leon bought this space in a 1031 exchange several years ago. I think he probably made a bad real estate investment and now needs to rezone it to make a profit on his investment. I've gotten it to a place where I can live with it, but I don't understand why we need to rezone this property at all.
Okay, thank you very much. We've reached the end of our speakers list. I don't see any additional hands up. So we'll turn now to questions from the board to staff, the applicant, or anyone who's spoken. And to be clear, these questions are the planning board's way of probing on topics that help us answer the main question that we have, which is, does it meet the rezoning criteria that Libby presented earlier? Fred.
Hi, thank you. Thanks to everybody who's spoken today. Take the time to comment, and thank you to staff for the report. Libby, I had a couple of quick questions for you. I've got 3 questions if I could do those quickly. First question is that I wonder if you can speak a little bit. In an awful lot of ways, the PUD that's being presented looks a lot like a traditional Chapter 59 PUD in its specificity with regards to use. It includes a site plan that's pretty restrictive, et cetera. And obviously our zoning code, in our 2010 zoning code, one of the, I think, pretty clearly stated objectives of that was to do away with this kind of very specific customized and very restrictive customized zoning. I wonder if you can speak to that and speak to the conversations that you guys had about bringing one like this forward.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Fred. Honestly, staff would have liked to have seen this be rezoned to a UMS 2X or UMX 2X zone district. Either of those mixed use districts would have been supported by plan guidance for this area. But as you've heard tonight, there's a lot of concern with adding commercial uses to this particular location. And so as Corey in particular emphasized, neighbors in the immediate area, as well as the larger Washington Park West neighborhood, have been working with the applicant for 2 years to kind of whittle down the list of uses that could be allowed here that would facilitate reuse of this building in a minimal, impactful way.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. One clarifying question I want to ask, and then I'll ask my final question. One of the commenters, a few of the commenters have spoken about there being an abundance of retail use. I want to clarify, as I understood it, this PUD doesn't allow retail uses as we classify them in the zoning code. Is that correct?
Correct. There's no retail establishments or restaurants or any of your more intensive commercial uses. It's really a limited subset within the arts and recreation categories, allowing like art studios or fitness studios, and then dental or medical offices.
Great, thank you. And then finally, I want to I want to delve a little bit into some of the plan guidance because there's a question in here that's been raised by commenters, and there does appear to be a little bit of a conflict to me here. When we look at your staff report, page 13, where we discuss future places and the residential low future place type, and to quote it, it does say that limited mixed use can occur along arterial and collector streets, as well as where commercial uses have been already established. Vacant institutional uses on corners or select sites may be appropriate locations to introduce additional residential intensity. And then if we go down to down to page 15, where you talk about some of the plan guidance regarding redevelopment of institutional sites within neighborhoods. And you mentioned strategy C under policy 6 that states that individual rezonings of these sites may be an opportunity for more intense residential uses or limited neighborhood services to be provided if done in a way that minimizes impacts to surrounding character, which I think it's pretty clear that's kind of the intent of this PUD certainly from what you just said as well. But these two do appear to conflict a bit in that the future places guidance would seem to indicate that what's appropriate here, particularly given that it's not on a collector or arterial, would be additional residential intensity. So I'm just wondering if you can help to reconcile those two different pieces of plan guidance, which appear a little bit to me to conflict.
I appreciate that. And internally, I think staff has certainly had a lot of conversations as well about how to read into the language in Blueprint, which is very specific and can kind of conflict with itself a little bit. As well as some of the folks pointing out that this church may not be completely vacant and maybe it's still being minimally used for congregations. So we haven't exactly gotten around to like how to define those or how to clarify those, but I think it is very clear based on the language that where there's a non-residential use that's existing, like a church, that may not be able to function as the institution that it has been previously, that is a site where we could expand its use into the future by reusing an existing building and either adding additional residential units to it or minimally impactful neighborhood serving businesses. So I appreciate that it's a little confusing and, you know, folks can kind of pick at it how they want, but I think that when you look at the language on a whole, the intent does meet the purpose of this PUD.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Libby.
Thank you. I've got Jordan, Angel, and then Ignacio.
Yes, so thanks, Libby. I think this is just a little bit repetitive, just to make sure I understand though. If the site was not to be rezoned to anything, PUD or one of the other mixed use or Main Street zones, as I understand, the option for the property is to continue operating as some sort of institutional use, a church or something comparable perhaps. And that's kind of it, right? Or they tear it down and they can build a couple of single family detached houses. Is there another option there that I'm missing if it were to not be rezoned?
No, I think you've got it. It's either leaving it under the existing USUB that would only allow a limited range of residential and some civic uses within the existing building or within two new like urban houses, or it's rezoning to a mixed use district to facilitate kind of the full use or the full range of uses within that church, or tearing it down.
So what was, you'd mentioned residential uses as in the current building form. My understanding was that there is a residential unit in there and that can be preserved. Is there ability to expand residential in the existing building under the current zone?
No, within the current zone, I believe you could only have like a single unit residential. So you couldn't do like a multi-unit.
Right, okay, thanks. That's just my question.
Thank you, Angel.
Yes, thank you all for the presentation. So I heard a couple of the community or the residents and community folks talking about the the existing usage for a church. I don't know if it was the original church or most recent church, or if it's being leased out, in terms of a visiting church for space. But with this rezoning to this PUD, would it allow for use of a church presence in the building along with other uses?
It would still allow for a church use, which is currently allowed within the existing USUB zoning.
Okay, and so the church that's currently in there would not necessarily be displaced. You would just add to the uses in the building. Is that correct?
That could be an option, but I don't know what the applicant's intent is down the road.
Okay.
Thank you. We have Ignacio, Heidi, and then myself.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation, Libby. Under the PUD, what percentage of the building is going to be non-residential? This is about 4,000 square foot building on the footprint. So what is all of it? Is the residential part of the building, the current residential part will remain residential? What is the intended use for the building there?
I would actually like to ask the applicant, Peter Wall, if maybe he could discuss that a little bit more.
Yes, please.
Appreciate the question, Ignacio. So the intent is to keep, there's a residential apartment that's located within the existing commercial, the actual church itself. I believe there was a pastor that lived there from one of the old congregations for a handful of years. So the goal is to keep that residential component and actually make it a piece that would attract a new user. One of the reasons, for instance, it's a possible scenario, and one of the reasons we wanted to leave that residential is this interesting kind of live work scenario where you could have an art studio, an art gallery, a photography studio, professional studio down below in the commercial area and the actual congregation area, and then have the ability for that individual that owned that business or operated that business to live above and actually kind of maintain some of what you used to see before with the church, with the pastor living there and working there. But yes, the goal is to keep the residential.
Okay, and I cannot picture exactly which is the worship area and which is I assume the one area that has the higher ceiling is the worship area. So the shorter, is that correct?
The worship area is located to the western portion of the building.
Okay.
So you essentially walk in. I'd say that the commercial area would be below when you walk in off of that surface parking lot. The residential unit is located above that commercial area, and then the actual congregation area is located to the western portion of the site.
Okay, so that is somewhere around 2,500 square feet?
The residential or the non-residential?
Well, I guess the area that you're calling residential. There's a reason why I'm asking this question.
I think it's a little smaller than that, Ignacio. I don't have exact square footage. I want to say it's somewhere closer to the ballpark of less than 2,000 square feet, but probably right around 1,500.
Okay, all right, thank you. So, Libby, going back to Article 11 of the code, which is the limitations. The first question that I asked myself was, well, why is it not just remaining with the current zone designation and use the limitations that you have to allow for commercial? Because that is, there are a limited uses, and there are also some other zoning permits that can be given based on that. But they have a cap, 20% of the building or 1,000, whichever is less, 1,000 square feet. So obviously these 2,000 square feet would not fit into that. We have seen in the past 6 years, several rezonings of churches which actually tend to be less embedded in the neighborhoods and more on the on collectors or arterials. I'm trying to justify that the justifying circumstances that you explain are actually valid. That number 4 criterion is really the crux of the matter here. You said it is your strongest article, and one of the purposes, Fred talked about it earlier today, for PUDs is just to be very specific, and we want to stay away from those. The whole genesis of the Denver zoning code was to, in part, stay away from PUDs. When I looked at this PUD, I thought that this was a throwaway PUD, especially because of the clause that you said that if this building gets demolished, it will go back to USUB. So the Sun Lot will go back to USUB. So, you know, are there, well, I guess I'm on the deliberation, not so much on the question. The question was the amount of commercial that is needed here, and why not stay within the parameters of the current zoning? So I don't know if you have an answer for that. Obviously, your presentation addressed that already. Thanks.
Thank you.
Libby, did you have anything to add to that as to why not stay with the current zoning, or have you covered that sufficiently? Entirely
I
up to
think
you.
we've pretty well addressed that the existing zoning does not allow for reuse of this church in a very viable manner. I mean, it seems to me like if we were going to impose the use restrictions on this particular building indefinitely, that eventually it would just be a vacant building until somebody finally came along and demolished it and built under the existing USUB regulations. And our Blueprint Denver policies very clearly embrace reusing these non-residential buildings that are embedded in our single unit neighborhoods and making them viable into the future. And while we, as I mentioned, like we would like to avoid a PUD, we are seeing these churches abandoned kind of throughout the city, and we'd love to develop a more holistic approach to addressing them in a manner that avoids PUDs, but right now that's the tool that we have.
Thank you. Heidi.
Thank you, Joel. So, Libby, an area I'd like to explore with you when we consider a PUD, because they are very unique. And I think the planning board members here are being rightfully thoughtful about granting a PUD, is this idea of the PUD being applied to unique and special circumstance and adaptive reuse. And so I've heard from the public, and a couple other people have hit on it, that it's not necessarily vacant, and that the church congregation is still in there. And what I'm wondering is how relevant that is, because does our acceptance of a PUD or our denial of a PUD really, is that really going to dictate what happens in the building? And so I guess what I'm asking you is, how relevant is what's actually occurring in the current building to the granting of a PUD? Should I really be considering whether there's a church congregation in there or not when I'm considering a PUD?
And how do you think that goes a little bigger? Like, I don't know that a single congregation that uses it a few hours of the week means that that building is really functioning as a church and fully being used, right? I think it's still ultimately being underutilized. And just based on national trends and what we've seen throughout the city, this church will likely not function for congregational purposes within the next few years. And so by continuing to limit it to the uses that are only allowed within the USUB, it's most likely that it would eventually be demolished and built as a couple of residential units, which that's what our zoning allows, but it's not necessarily what's supported by our plan policies.
Okay, thank you, Libby. That's what I'm just trying to get at is I don't necessarily think that I'm trying to understand how I should consider the existing use that's in the building with what our plan guidance says about granting a PUD. And I'm not seeing the clear connection between granting a PUD and what might exactly be going on in the building at this time. I'm understanding your answer. It's
right.
It's making sense to me.
Right. Yeah. But that direct nexus between what's going on there today and what the PUD would allow, I don't know that that's necessarily like one of the things that we're really looping into the PUD criteria. And as I did mention, like that congregation could continue to be allowed to operate in that church if that's something that's viable for the owner. Otherwise, they may be able to still allow some small space for congregations while transitioning to something else. But ultimately, I don't know what the exact future looks like for this development. And I think we just need to figure out whether or not this PUD allows for the right approach.
Right. That's what's always tricky, Libby, is just when we're looking at rezoning is use. It's easy to get hung up on use. And I'm just trying to get to that heart of our criteria of what, of why we would grant and why we would allow PUD. So thanks for your answer.
Thank you. I'll follow up on a few questions. The first, just jumping off of the justifying circumstances. The question about is there currently a congregation there or not? Certainly, we don't have any criteria that says there must not be a current active tenant to have a rezoning. But yet we have this, perhaps the least favored of my criteria, which is justifying circumstances. In my way of thinking about how planning should guide zoning, if one is seeking zoning, the question should be, is it consistent with plans? And that should be the whole question. But we do have this criteria, justifying circumstances, and changed or changing conditions is what's cited, and specifically this change that we see very often. And Libby, you talked about with churches going away. I'm looking at page 29 of the application, and that's what the applicant cites, that the two congregations that previously owned the church cited decreased demand for religious services as part of the reason why they sold it to the current owner. So in terms of staff's analysis of justifying circumstances, you found that to be sufficient, that this shows that it's part of this broader pattern we're familiar with. Is that right?
That's one of the justifying circumstances. Certainly, it is a trend that's occurring throughout the city, and one that Blueprint acknowledges as well, that we really need to get ahead of this and develop a more holistic approach. So that's one of the justifying circumstances. And the other is the fact that the plan does have specific policy related to this exact condition.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the tension that Fred talked about, because I think it's probably the most interesting part of this. Most neighborhoods have embedded non-residential uses, and broadly they're commercial and non-commercial non-residential uses. So the corner store, traditional neighborhoods would have corner stores and the like. So structures that were built for non-residential purposes and have had, whether it's a retail store or something else that we're very familiar with being embedded within neighborhoods. The zoning code allows that when those change use, they can, even if their zoning is residential, they can pick from a limited mixed use list as if they were zoned UMS 2X. The other category is non-residential, non-commercial. So schools and churches typically that you find embedded within neighborhoods. And we don't have a good built into the zoning code list of alternate uses for those structures. They're certainly not built for residential use. This was not built to be simply residential. but because it's in a residential zone district, it really only has the choice of being residential or a school or a church, essentially. So we have Blueprint Denver guidance that says we should be pro adaptive reuse. We also have Blueprint Denver guidance that says in residential areas where there are institutional uses that go away, that might be an opportunity to increase residential density on corners and places where institutional uses did exist. So my question is, am I right in looking at the PUD and seeing that we're leaning towards the former of the two goals in Blueprint Denver to promote adaptive reuse, but because this wasn't a commercial use before, we're not going as far as we might with a corner store where they can just do the 2X list of uses. It's a negotiated list, rather than leaning towards the other also recommendation of our plans, which is opportunistically increased density for residential. Was that kind of the key choice that was made?
That is, I mean, and it's not necessarily a choice. Like staff would love to avoid PUDs, but clearly our zoning code does not allow for every single circumstance or development that might be opportunistic at a particular site. So here, in order to kind of facilitate like reuse of this church, this PUD we felt was the best vehicle. Otherwise, within the USUB, even with demolishing this church and redeveloping it, it would not meet the plan goals of maybe increasing residential density at the site. And to really facilitate any new commercial uses, that would probably still mean demolishing the building and building the more general or shopfront commercial building to allow for those other uses. So, and that would be, I think, much more impactful to the neighborhood than maintaining the existing building.
I see. So it sounds like you're walking an interesting line where if there was an application for and plan support for a UMX 2X zoning, that would itself not incentivize the reuse. It would allow the wider use list, but the incentive might be there to replace the building in a place where our plans say, well, it's on two local streets and there aren't a lot of indicators this is the right place for it to incentivize replacing the building. So the PUD has been crafted to, if the building chooses to remain, it has a somewhat wider use list that's been negotiated. And if they decide not to, then it's clear what will happen as well in terms of without having a rezoning, still being able to do what USUB allows.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really a key point there, is that if this was rezoned into the UMS or UMX districts, that almost incentivized demolishing the existing building and building something brand new and really maximizing the use of that site in something that's not as appropriate in the middle of a residential neighborhood.
Okay, that really helps me understand the intention behind finding the path to the PUD. It's leaning on that adaptive reuse. I do appreciate that. And Jill.
Yeah, I am curious about the small area plan for this particular spot. How does it guide this decision, if it does? And how recent is the plan?
Unfortunately, the plan's from 1991. So it was well before the zoning code was updated to 2010. And yet it still acknowledges the existence of churches and other civic buildings in the neighborhood and says that they do fit in compatibly and lend themselves to the character of the neighborhood, and that they should be preserved where they currently exist.
Right. And yeah, this is our dilemma, because in 1991, people were still getting up, going to church on Sunday. I say it as someone married to a pastor, and similar scenarios that I've seen. And without updated guidance, the thought processes from community about the area, and without a comprehensive plan about this adaptive reuse, you're left to be responsive to an application and find the best fit. It feels like I think I like the idea of adaptive reuse in this. This may be for the next section, but it just feels like it's hard for the folks at planning to be strategic without these tools, the small area plan, a comprehensive plan about adaptive reuse. And I know it's on the way, but in the meanwhile, it feels like this is the best option.
Thank you, Ignacio.
So, this PUD is kind of a black or white thing. There is no gray zone here, and the gray zone in one scenario could be. Now I'm looking at the worship area of the building. It is the original. It has some character. I'm an architect, so I can tell you that. And that one scenario would be played something like, the idea of the art studio is actually a really good one. Let's preserve that space, but demolish the rest because the rest actually doesn't have that architectural character. Well, then your PUD would be completely useless in that scenario, and you would not be able to do anything in that scenario. How would you play that? Were you be able to make a modification to section 4.3 of the PUD, or?
I'm sorry, could you clarify your question?
So the question is, the premise to the question is that the PUD is very specific. It's black or white. It's you keep the building the way it is, or if you demolish it, then you go back to USUB, right? Mm-hmm. There is one scenario that I don't see if you played it out, which was the keeping of the worship space, which is the western part of the building, the one that has the architectural character, the original building, and so on. That is not played out anywhere, right? Could the PUD, since the PUD is a tool for doing that kind of stuff, be amended in a way that you be able to keep that part and still develop the rest of the building, the rest of the zone lots?
No, I don't think anybody wants to see additional development on the zone lot around the existing building. They certainly do need to maintain the existing surface parking lot in order to service future use of the building. So, I mean, the worship area under the existing zoning as well as the PUD can continue to be utilized for future congregations. Or as I mentioned, maybe there's a potential to maintain some worship space and start introducing some of the other spaces allowed in the PUD. But ultimately, and I think really based on the fact that we're just trying to implement our plan guidance regarding reuse of an existing building, and based on the feedback from the neighborhood of wanting to either use that building or see it developed under the USUB zone district, we didn't want to incentivize any more development around the existing building.
All right, let me rephrase it this way then. Partial demolition is there space for partial demolition of this? All right, thank you. I guess Peter wants to add something. I would like to. Joel, if you have no objection, let Peter respond.
Mr. Wall?
Thanks, Ignacio. I think I know what you're getting at, so let me try and chime in here. Based on the interest that not only the property owner, Leon, but his broker have seen, there really hasn't been a conversation around partial demolition, because future users, whether it be a dentist or whether it would be an artist, there's a desire to preserve the entire structure. So they think, even though I agree with you, the place of worship definitely has the most architectural integrity and is the most interesting. The rest of the building still certainly has, a good use for a future user. And I think that's why that we structured the PUD in such a way that we didn't want to look at partial demolition as a viable option there, because it just wasn't something that we've really seen interest in based on interest from potential future users here.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see Gosha and Angel. Gosha.
Yes, thank you. To me, where I struggle, my question is, because I think the whole application kind of hinges on the assumption that the building carries the value and utilizing the existing structure is more beneficial or more in accordance with adopted plans that demolition and replacing it with something else. And so I wonder, because we start seeing more and more of these PUDs, and I think that's concerning. I think we're all kind of troubled by it. And so I try to get to the essence of this decision, like how do we decide which structures merit special treatment? Because in this case, definitely the zone lot is receiving a special treatment by receiving the PUD. So how do we decide what structures or what conditions are warrant this kind of treatment versus not? And I think the reason I ask that question is because as we look at the PUD, there are very specific drawings, both site drawings and elevation drawings that kind of speak to the design and architecture. And I think we're trying to avoid making these decisions, right? We're trying to avoid making policy decisions or entitlement decisions based on design or specific configuration of the site. So that's where I'm a little troubled. I would like to hear your opinion about how are these decisions made? How was this decision made to warrant the special treatment to this particular structure?
I appreciate that question. And I think it's something that if we could ever fit it into our work program to develop a more holistic approach to addressing similar instances throughout the city, then developing criteria to determine what structures should be preserved would be excellent. But right now we don't have that criteria. And we just pretty much have a blanket policy within Blueprint that says that we should be preserving these buildings, even if they're not historic. And it gets really subjective into trying to determine whether or not someone thinks one building is worthy of preservation or another outside of kind of our historic landmarking designation. But I really appreciate the consideration, and I think that it's something that the city should kind of put in its back pocket as it continues to consider these rezoning requests, because they're likely in the pipeline.
Thank you for sharing my concern and the response. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions before we turn to deliberation? Okay, seeing none, I'll close the public hearing and ask for deliberation. Fred.
Hi, thanks. And boy, thanks for an extended question session. Lots of good information that came out of there. I have a couple of comments I want to make. I mean, this whole question of what is, I think, very much a traditional Chapter 59 PUD is an interesting one. And I have to admit to some misgivings about doing something like that. I fear, and if it weren't wildly inappropriate, I'd be taking bets on when this property might come back for a rezoning because they're unable to make it work within the constraints of this, whether it's now or in 10 years. And so that does worry me because I think that's contradictory to what the city was trying to achieve with the 2010 zoning code. At the same time, I would like to say that I heard very much from Libby about how they got to this point, and I appreciate the fact that this is coming to us as a customized zoning rather than coming to us as a conforming zone district with either covenants or deed restrictions being proposed to go alongside it, which I think is something that we have seen people using in Denver to simulate customized zoning. And I think it is problematic because suddenly you've got it sitting on the title instead of in the zoning. And that creates some other issues. So I do appreciate that if this is the path they were going to go down, that they're bringing it forward in zoning as opposed to pretending that it's a conforming zone district and putting restrictions on the property through deed restrictions that create all kinds of other issues going forward. I think it's important for just to note that the change of use, even to these less intensive uses, is likely to be a challenging and expensive proposition for the property owner. And I comment on this so that we give some thought as the city discusses policies about adaptive reuse to figuring out how to make adaptive reuse financially viable, because that is, as a developer, I can tell you, a concern. Finally, I want to comment on this question of churches and whether actually I have one more after this. This question of what's happening with churches as a change in circumstance that justifies a rezoning. You know, I really think that if we look back at land use patterns in this country, churches were seen as a necessary neighborhood amenity. They were placed there, they were community resource, they were walkable, they were community based, and I think they were often included in master planning as something that was a critical piece. And we're now seeing that changing. So this isn't just about, at least in my perspective, just about churches having a hard time making congregations work. I think how churches work are different and the land use implications are different, in that congregations now are not geographically based in the same way that they once were in this country. People drive to church very often now, as we heard from some of the commenters who talked about how much street parking church services did take up. So I think that is a change in how we see land use in this country. And so that, to my mind, is a little bit different. The crux of this for me, because we go back to the criteria, really does resolve around that question I asked, which I think Joel expanded upon a bit, about what we see in the future places versus the adaptive reuse. I think the adaptive reuse language is very strong in Blueprint. And I think one of our jobs here, if it was just a matter of ticking boxes, we wouldn't necessarily need a planning board to examine whether or not an application meets the criteria. It is sometimes a matter of weighing and balancing and trying to understand where the emphasis is. And I believe that there's enough leeway in that future places that speaks to some of this. And I believe that the language around adaptive reuse, particularly of former institutional buildings, is strong enough that I believe there's planned support for this, and I will be supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Very thoughtful as always. I want to thank everybody who came to speak today and everybody who wrote letters. As always happens when there's differences of opinion, planning board is in the position of listening to everybody, but needing to filter what we hear down to what helps us, what informs us about analyzing the criteria. And so my comments and my colleagues' comments, of course, will speak to that, but it doesn't mean that we haven't heard your other opinions and preferences. I won't bury the lead here. I do believe this meets the criteria, but I want to pull it apart a little bit because I think it's actually very interesting. When I received my planning board packet a week ago to review this and got to looking through it, my first thought was, oh no, PUD. I thought we weren't trying to do that. And oh no, limited use list. Okay, is this just a fight over the use list? But fortunately, it's a lot more interesting than that. This isn't a commercial building. This wasn't a building created for commercial purposes. This is a building that was created to be a church embedded in a residential neighborhood. And so it doesn't have access to other uses it can do unless the zoning is changed. So to one of the comments from a neighbor who said, I don't know why we need to change the zoning. If the building is to be preserved and reused, which is a question, which is an option for the property owner, then essentially if it's not going to be used for its built purpose, it probably needs a zoning change. It needs more allowances. And I appreciate that you all spent a couple of years negotiating what those allowances would be. But we do have this tension in the plan guidance between opportunistically, we're in a housing crisis, let's add more housing. Not 2 more single units on a big lot, but something more than that, because it is an opportunity and Blueprint calls on us to look for those opportunities. On the other hand, it says, and the neighborhood plan says, preserve these church structures. They're important to the character of the neighborhood. And although the neighborhood plan is a little bit older, that element of what it says is adopted plan guidance, and this building was already there at the time that the plan was created. So this building is even older than the plan guidance. So I don't see any conflict leaning towards trying to make adaptive reuse work. And I can see all the pieces lining up here to say, we don't know that it will work out to find an art studio or an office or one of the allowed uses. But if it does, let's encourage it to work by saying you get to keep this building and use it for these purposes, provided you keep the building. If you don't keep the building, then the PUD is not setting up an incentive of higher density as encouragement to demolish the building. You just get kind of the same zoning that is in the neighborhood without having to rezone. This reverts to that use list and those forms. I think this makes this better than a former Chapter 59 rezoning. Let me use an example from my neighborhood. We talked about churches and schools, but another thing that can often happen within neighborhoods is like a fire station. This little fire station at 32nd and Curtis, and the fire department no longer needed it. They have bigger, better, fire stations and response times, etc. So it was sold, but nobody wanted to demolish it. It's got neat, funky character. And so under former Chapter 59, which is, for those of you watching, it's the old zoning code, they did a PUD. And they wanted to do a PUD to allow a pro-social employment use called the Women's Bean Project, where low-income women would come together and get employment experience, produce something that there's a demand for, get experience both on production side, sales side, etc. Wonderful organization. That PUD was written for bean assembly. If you read that PUD, it is ridiculous. It says you're going to use this many square feet for putting things in boxes, and this many square feet for a little kitchen area, and this many square feet for sorting beans or whatever. And if you ever wanted to change what you're doing, you had to go rezone, not just from Women's Bean Project to something else, because the whole thing was about bean assembly written into the zoning code, but even they stopped using a commercial kitchen and needed more space to assemble boxes. Technically, they were in violation of their zoning, because their zoning was telling them how many square feet they use for commercial kitchen versus, putting things in bags. This is far better than that. This establishes a list of uses that can be used in the existing building. And yes, it has a site plan, and yes, it has elevations, but it's trying to encourage if you keep the existing building, you get to do these things. But if you don't keep the existing building, it says what happens then. Our past PUDs never said what happens then. It just throws you to the wolves, and you have to go do a rezoning. And the rezoning churn with custom zoning was one of the many terrible aspects about this. This has it embedded in. If you don't keep the building, then this is what happens. And so I think this is an interesting evolution of using PUDs and how they can incentivize what we want, but also have a path right in them for what happens if we don't get that, what reasonable thing is next. So not only do I think this meets the criteria, I just wanted to praise that, although it took me all week to really see how it came together and what staff is doing with the evolution of custom zoning. I can say more, but I've already said a lot. Thanks for honoring the neighborhood plan. And I agree with Fred that as complicated as PUDs are, this is better than shadow regulations that are negotiated privately and not visible to everybody. Thank you. Gosha.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. I agree with everything has been said. Just kind of want to layer a little more of my perspective on it. I really agree with the premise of this rezoning. I think both adaptive reuse and incorporating neighborhood serving businesses are the right way. I think, we talk about it oftentimes that expanding the definition of the residential zoning to allow the neighborhood serving businesses to serve the neighborhoods that they're in makes perfect sense. It also, I'm a big proponent of allowing buildings to evolve and change and shift between residential and commercial use or light retail or whatever, however we define it. It makes sense for cities to evolve and kind of shift and for us to reuse the structures that exist. So I think I'm very much supportive of the premise of the background of the application. I do struggle with the format or the tool that we're using to achieve this outcome. And I kind of want to go back to what Ignacio was saying, that I think the application or the PUD is very rigid in the sense that preserves the entire structure, or it's all or nothing, and doesn't allow for any flexibility. Like, what if in the future, 10 years from now, somebody wanted to reuse part of the structure, maybe expand it or demolish to allow for more open space or any other variation of it. So I think we're still kind of stuck in this kind of very rigid PUD in that sense that doesn't allow for some flexibility and more evolution of this structure that maybe is partially historical and part of it is worth preserving, but maybe not all of it. So that's where I am. I'm looking forward to hearing the other comments before I make my decision. Thank you.
Thank you. Ignacio.
So one of the things I said during my question opportunity actually was more of the diatribe about what this is, and this I don't think I'm wrong calling it a throwaway PUD, and because of the issue of the demolition, and I would even say that a partial demolition would actually void the entire PUD, and then if you want to keep the worship area, then you have to either change zoning or go back to USUB. But I think the real point here is the justifying circumstance, and what we were told in the presentation is that the justifiable circumstances that the changing conditions affect this area and reflect a national trend of declining congregations and closing churches. Yeah, that is a fact. I don't think that fact alone is a justifying circumstance. And previous board members had a real hard time with this fourth criterion. What is really the justifying circumstance? And the issue is that the rezoning has to be in the public interest. So what is in the public interest that this rezoning would be permissible. And one argument of the preservation of the building as a sustainable and resilient community is valid. The greenest building is the building that is already built. I buy that argument. So just because this is a throwaway PUD, I will be supporting the application.
Thank you. Any other deliberation? Okay, I would entertain a motion with the reminder that we have 7 planning board members present, and to pass any motion, we need 5 votes. Would someone like to make a motion?
I'll be happy to make a motion.
Fred?
I move to recommend that City Council approve official map amendment application number 2020 I-00141 for 1001 and 1003 South Pearl Street from USUB to PUD G29, finding that the applicable review criteria have been met.
Second.
It's been moved by Fred and seconded by Ignacio. Discussion on the motion. Okay, do a roll call vote. Angel?
Aye.
Fred?
Aye.
Gosha?
Aye.
Heidi?
Aye.
Ignacio?
Aye.
Jordan?
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. That passes unanimously with 7 votes. Thank you very much. I'll give the board an option. We've been going for an hour and a half. We have 1 rezoning hearing left before we have 2 very interesting info items. We have no speakers signed up that I see for the next item. My inclination is to go through the next rezoning and then take a little break. Is that all right with everyone? All right, I'm seeing some thumbs up. So with that, I'll open the public hearing for official map amendment application 2022I-00028, a rezoning of 610 South Vine Street from USUC to USUC1. And we have Edson Ibanez with the staff report.
Can you see my screen? Just wanted to make sure.
You're not in presentation mode.
Sorry, I was speaking to mute. Thank you, Fred.
Let me try again. My screen's kind of acting up right now.
It may be that if you leave it in presentation mode, stop sharing, and then start sharing, you can pick the window that is the presentation.
Okay. Let me try again. Perfect. Can you see that now?
Looks great. Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Edson Ibanez. I am with CPD, and today before you we're presenting 610 South Vine Street, and it is going from USUC1 to USUC to USUC1. So the subject property is located in Council District 6 in the Washington Park neighborhood. So the request is from a single unit zone district with a minimum lot size of 5,500 square feet to a USUC1, which is a single unit zone district with a minimum lot size of 5,500 square feet, but it would allow for an accessory dwelling unit. Currently, it is a single unit dwelling and it is just over 6,000 square feet. The zoning is USUC. It's surrounded by USUC, which is single unit zone district. And close proximity, we do have an MU, a multi-unit zone district, and MS, which is a main street zone district. So the subject property, like I mentioned, is a single story, single family house. It is on the top left corner, and it is predominantly between 1 and 2 story structures in close proximity to the site. And it is before you today is tentatively scheduled to go before City Council on August 1st. And to date, we've received 2 letters of support and then 6 letters of opposition. One of the letters of opposition is from the East Washington Park RNO, which voted for the application, stating that it is not consistent with the review criteria. And then the other 5 letters mention concerns around property values, parking, traffic, quality of life, short-term rental concerns, and safety. Now, there are several review criteria that we analyzed for a rezoning case. And here are the 5, and I will jump into these. So the first one is consistency with adopted plans. And this specific property falls under 2 plans, which is Comprehensive Plan 2040 and Blueprint Denver, a Land Use and Transportation Plan of 2019. There are several, this specific application falls under several strategies found in Comprehensive Plan 2040 that are specified in the staff report. Now, within Blueprint Denver, this area is classified as urban, which is small multi-unit residential and low-intensity mixed-use buildings are typically embedded in single-unit and 2-unit residential areas. And it's classified as residential low for the future place type, which is predominantly single and 2-unit uses, and accessory dwelling units are appropriate. For the street type, Vine Street as well as Center are both local streets which are primarily characterized by residential uses. And then for all other areas of the city for the future growth area, where we anticipate 10% of new employment and 20% of new housing. Blueprint also has a specific policy in the land use and built form, Housing Policy 4, that specifically says diversify housing choice through the expansion of accessory dwelling units throughout all residential areas. And for review criteria 2, 3, and 5, it is found consistent as specified in the staff report. And for the 4th criteria, justifying circumstances, it is consistent by a city adopted plan as referenced within Blueprint by allowing ADUs in all residential areas. Therefore, CPD recommends approval based that all the findings of the review criteria have been met. I am open for questions, as well as the applicant/property owner is here to also answer any questions.
Thank you. And the applicant is only for questions, or is there a presentation?
No, just for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. We did not have anyone sign up in advance to make comment on this item, but I see we have 11 people from the public on. If you did come to speak to this item, if you could use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and we will call on you. This is that part of the agenda. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up, but I will just note for the record that we all did receive the communications that Edson spoke about, even ones that came in quite recently have been forwarded to us. So we will be taking those into account. We'll move to questions from the board to staff or the applicant. Fred.
Thanks. Edson, can I just ask one quick question? A couple of the comments referenced short-term rentals, and I'm just kind of wondering, is there any evidence that ADUs are more often used as short-term rentals than other types of properties?
I don't know. I don't have the data for that specifically.
Okay.
I know that that's a question that comes up, and most of the time we let the individuals that have concerns talk to existing licensing, because there is specific requirements that if they do want to do a short-term rental license like an Airbnb, then they can only do the ADU, they can't do their primary residence. So there's specific limitations of what can be done. I'm not sure, Andrew, do you know, have you seen those numbers?
Thanks, Edson. I have not, but I'm be glad to see if we can track those down and provide them to the board.
I just think it is a concern people raise, and I'm not sure that it's a well-founded concern, but I haven't seen the data to support it or refute it. So I just think it's a question that we might want to look at later, but thank you.
Thank you. We're still on questions. Heidi.
Thank you, Joel. I just wanted to respond to Fred anecdotally. There's 10 houses on my block face. 2 have ADUs. Both are long-term rentals. It's just anecdotal. That's not quantitative, but an observation that at least provides you some data point. I have no questions.
Okay, thank you. With no more questions, I'll close the public hearing and ask for deliberations. Fred.
Thanks. I had 2 quick comments I wanted to make, mostly with regards to the public comment, because I think that the plan guidance is very clear in this case. However, there were a couple of things that really concerned me that I saw in the comments. And again, I raised this because I think there are issues that we as a city probably need to speak to at some point. The first is that the RNO's comments about this not being consistent with adopted plans because it's not consistent with the adopted zoning code was baffling, and I think displays a kind of concerning lack of understanding of how plans and zoning work together in Denver. And if we are to continue in this city to grant RNOs sort of a special official status of representing neighborhoods, and that's a whole other question. It just seems to me that there has got to be some training for RNOs of some sort. So that's one. The second is that I do want to comment, because I saw this and it really bothered me, this implication that those who can afford to live in ADUs, i.e. those of lesser means, are somehow less worthy. The implication that simply because someone lives in an ADU as a renter, that they jeopardize the safety of their neighbors is concerning and frankly kind of offensive. The statement that ADU tenants are often in transition. My own ADU tenant, who is a long-term tenant, is in transition. She's a single woman who's a nurse and in the midst of completing pre-med. So she's transitioning from being a nurse to being a doctor. And that the implication that somehow she is less worthy of living in one of our neighborhoods is deeply, deeply concerning to me, and to the point of being offensive. So I'm sorry, I just felt I had to say something about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ignacio.
Yeah, no, I think this also, I agree that this meets all the criteria. And we are seeing, like a little resurgence of resistance to ADUs. That is understandable. People are afraid of the unknown. And I don't know what the statistics are for this East Washington Park neighborhood in terms of how many dwelling units have ADUs, but it's not as many other neighborhoods. And we're just in the beginning of the ADU era, if you want, for Denver, which I think, again, take the opportunity to say that the whole city should be blanketed with the ability to have these additional dwelling units in all single-family neighborhoods. So it's understandable that people fear parking and so on, but the benefits are greater than the opposite. There will be more eyes on the street, more eyes in the alleys, and that will actually even build a community better, even if the ADU is used as a short-term rental. There's no ill on that either. So I will be supporting it. Thank you.
Thank you. As always, my colleagues have said all the salient points. I just want to reiterate that I believe this meets the criteria. Blueprint's very clear that ADUs should be allowed in all areas, encourages the city to legislatively change the zoning to allow them in all residential areas. And until that is done, specifically calls on us to support individual rezonings. So it meets that and all of the other criteria. And thank you, Fred, for getting there first on the response to the RNOs. We had a longtime member of the planning board, Don Elliott, who worked all over the country on zoning codes, and he always praised Denver in having a clear distinction between planning and zoning, and then administrative implementation of the zoning and other regulations. We keep those very clearly separate, and they flow downwards. You know, we do our community plans, and that informs what the zoning should be. And when you have the zoning, that controls what you're allowed to do in terms of buildings and uses. And so the confusion that you can't change the zoning because it would change the zoning shows that there's some confusion among those three levels. And the prescription, of course, is education, and we should do more with whatever we're doing with RNOs or other ways we organize community input and information. But we also need to be sure that we don't slip. And by we, I mean everyone involved at a city level on volunteer boards and commissions like planning board and city council and staff, to always keep those layers very separate and clear, because that's a great strength that Denver has. And when other cities get wrapped around the axle and have debates about should we get the zoning, do I like the color that of the building that they're going to build, you know, they're confusing these levels. So I like the fact that we keep that distinct. I'm looking for any other deliberation, and seeing no deliberation from planning board members, I'll ask for a motion.
I will, if nobody's else can step forward. I move to recommend that City Council approve official map amendment application number 2022I-00028 at 610 Vine Street, actually I believe that's 610 South Vine Street, from USUC to USUC1, finding that the applicable review criteria have been met.
Second.
Moved by Fred and seconded by Jordan. Any discussion on the motion? I'll do a roll call vote. Angel?
Aye.
Fred?
Aye.
Gosha?
Aye.
Heidi?
Aye.
Ignacio?
Aye.
Jordan?
Aye.
And I vote aye as well. That's 7 ayes. That motion passes unanimously. Thank you. We're going to take a short recess. Let's come back at the top of the hour, about a 7-minute recess. I'll see you at 5 o'clock. Please turn off your cameras and microphones while you're gone. And please turn on your camera when you return so we know everyone's here. Thank you. And planning board members, as you return, if I could ask you to turn on your cameras so we know when everyone is back. We're waiting for Ignacio, Jordan, and Gosha. Hello, Ignacio. Jordan and Gosha, when you get back, if you could turn on your cameras, we'll know that you're here. Hello, Jordan. And Gosha, are you back with us? Okay, while we're waiting for Gosha, I'll just say we're on the part of the agenda that's information items. This is the part of the agenda that we receive information publicly about matters that are upcoming. They may be things in progress or things nearing completion. Today we have two information items, Cherry Creek East overlay and the Sunnyside overlay. Welcome back Libby Kaiser, who's going to tell us about the Cherry Creek overlay, Cherry Creek East overlay. And welcome back, Gosha. We are ready to begin. Over to you, Libby.
All right. All right, here we go. So hello again, planning board members. I am Libby Kaiser with CPD, and I am going to provide a status update regarding proposed design overlays for Cherry Creek East. There are two design overlays proposed: the street level and upper story setbacks with open space alternatives design overlay district, or DO9, would apply to multi-unit and mixed-use commercial districts, while the front porch and landscaping at residential design overlay district, or DO10, would apply to low-scale residential districts. Properties currently within planned unit developments, of which there are many in Cherry Creek East, would not be affected unless they were rezoned. As the overlays could be applied to other areas within the city, they have been given more descriptive titles rather than specifically referencing Cherry Creek East. City Councilman Chris Hines of Council District 10 plans to submit a proposal for legislative rezoning to apply the new design overlay districts to the Cherry Creek East neighborhood, which is located southwest of Alameda Avenue and Colorado Boulevard. The proposed overlays are the result of a multi-year process led by the Cherry Creek East Association with assistance from City Council District 10 and consulting services. Councilman Hines has requested a text amendment to establish the design overlays and plans to request a map amendment to apply them to properties within the neighborhood. Now, design overlays are tools that the city can use to enhance design outcomes in a particular area by adding or modifying standards to the underlying zone district. And an overlay cannot be used to restrict or expand the uses allowed in the underlying district. Within Blueprint Denver, it says that design overlays can be appropriate in developing or redeveloping areas with a specific design vision, such as Cherry Creek East, where the Cherry Creek Area Plan of 2012 recommends tools such as upper story setbacks to allow sunlight to reach the street. And highlighted here from the Cherry Creek Area Plan is a recommendation to explore how upper story setbacks and other horizontal breaks in building facades can make streets more pedestrian friendly. And now I will dig into the D09 overlay that applies to commercial areas. So its intent is to enhance and promote a quality urban environment with a vibrant sense of place, including access to generous pedestrian zones and public spaces with streets that prioritize the pedestrian realm as a defining element of neighborhood character, with buildings that relate to pedestrians in scale and activity. And the overlay would apply to properties within multi-unit residential office, residential mixed use, and Main Street zone districts in Cherry Creek East. Here's a couple of the existing commercial buildings in Cherry Creek East. And you can see that they lack upper story setbacks and don't have a great sense of pedestrian scale or orientation. So to help achieve better design, the D09 overlay includes several building form standards that would be applied in addition to the standards of the underlying zone district. The first requires the building frontage along a primary street to be within 5 to 20 feet of the lot line. And that can be reduced to 0 to 15 feet if private open space is provided for no more than 25% of the building frontage. The building form standards also require 5-foot setbacks from primary and side streets. However, a 0-foot setback is allowed if at least 7% of the zone lot contains private open space. Within 13,000 square feet, non-parking uses shall occupy the floor area above street level for a minimum depth of 15 feet for at least 70% of the frontage along primary and side streets. As an alternative, structured parking facades must be integrated into the overall facade design through use of similar building materials and facade articulation and fenestration patterns, as well as non-transparent facade materials and fully shielded lighting. This limitation to visible parking and its alternative are similar to the standards in the existing Rhino design overlay, but this overlay takes it a step further and requires parking floors be adaptable to other uses for a minimum depth of 30 feet from the primary or side street facing building facade. These graphics help show how the overlay could be applied. The building on the left utilizes a 5-foot street level setback and upper story setbacks to improve the streetscape and reduce the building's mass. In lieu of these setbacks, the building on the right provides private open space on at least 10% of the lot. In both instances, the overlay allows enough flexibility to encourage creative building designs while helping to improve the quality of the built environment. Finally, the building from standards in D09 establishes, preserves access to daylight and promotes creative building designs. On buildings greater than 6 stories, a 13-foot setback would be required above the 3rd story. And on buildings greater than 9 stories, a 20-foot setback would also be required above the 9th story. The exact depth of these setbacks is still being evaluated and could change, among other standards, based on additional feedback from the Cherry Creek East Neighborhood Association and the general public. Then moving on to the second overlay, the intent of the proposed D10 overlay is to promote pedestrian-friendly street frontages and enhance neighborhood safety in portions of residential neighborhoods that are comprised primarily of single-unit, 2-unit, and row house development. And the overlay would apply similarly to properties with single unit, 2-unit, and row house zone districts in Cherry Creek East, but could also be applied elsewhere. The only building form standard in DO10 relates to pedestrian access on the primary or side street and requires an unenclosed porch with a minimum depth of 6 feet and a minimum area of 48 square feet. Front porches are already prevalent in the neighborhood, and this standard is intended to continue this tradition. With regard to landscaping standards, the overlay increases the required percentage of live planting material in the area abutting the primary street from 50% to 60%, while 40% of other open areas would be landscaped with either live or non-live landscaping material. The overlay also requires a minimum of 1 tree for each dwelling unit within the primary or side street setback or in the adjacent street right-of-way. Existing trees can count towards this requirement, and the city forester can determine that a new private tree would not be required if it would conflict with existing or proposed public trees. Finally, the overlay requires 2 outdoor light fixtures for each dwelling unit intended to illuminate the primary or side street setback area, as well as the rear setback area. And that's it for an overview of these overlays. Thanks for the opportunity to introduce them. We will release a public review draft soon, and we'll conduct a second internal review to ensure the overlays follow existing zoning code protocols and can be administered clearly. We'll also map the draft amendment and identifying where the Cherry Creek East overlays will apply. And once that text amendment is finalized, we'll come back to you all for a public hearing before taking it to City Council. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's have some discussion. What questions do we have? Ignacio.
Yeah, thank you, Libby. Really nice. Slide number 12, if you can share it again.
Sure.
You have the sample of the 2 building envelopes with the simulation of the setbacks and the 2 scenarios. It looks to me the one on the right-hand side is has less volume than the one on the left. Is intention that, or because developers will try to get all the volume that they can get, right?
Right. No, we modeled the various scenarios that could be achieved through kind of a combination of the different standards, including the base standards, which encourage the ground level and upper story setbacks, and compared those to the resulting gross square footage that you would get if you built under the private open space alternatives. And ultimately we found like very, very small percentage difference, like less than 5%, which I know can add up, but I think in some of our scenarios, it was even like 1 or 3%. So we do feel like these are pretty well calibrated to either have developers pursue the base standards or to give them some flexibility in pursuing the private open space alternatives.
Okay, and talking about calipers, the tree lawn or the landscape requirements increased to 60%. That's good, but what wasn't clear to me is you are not, this landscape requirements are not within the right of way, right? Or are they?
This is on the lot itself.
Okay.
So within the private zone lot. Yep.
All right, good, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. The queue as I have it is Angel, Fred, Heidi, and Gosha. Angel.
Thank you. I'm new to this stuff, and I'm just curious how you decide the specifics of these design overlays for a specific community. How much of it is functional versus aesthetic in terms of determining for, East Cherry Creek, what these setbacks are and these different parameters.
This process really started on the initiative of the Cherry Creek East Neighborhood Association, and they hired a couple of consultants, Richard Farley and Ellen Idelson, who are actually former employers or employees of CPD. So they really worked closely with the Neighborhood Association to identify what streetscape qualities they wanted to achieve in really improving the pedestrian space in the commercial context anyways, and opening it up to more daylight, just creating more meaningful private open space as well, and more interesting building design. And so they had a lot of back and forth in crafting these standards, and then did a lot of outreach with the community as well, including developers, to make sure that there was support for these and that they weren't too onerous in taking away development rights from folks. And so we got involved in the process a couple of years ago, and then have really kind of had to adjust some of the proposed standards so that they meet some of our existing zoning protocols in how we format our standards, how we define our standards and measure them, and making sure that they're just consistent with other sections within the code.
And do you have in mind other areas of the city where this may be applied as well when you're looking at these, or is it really strictly for this community?
I don't have any other areas in my mind off the bat. But when staff was reviewing these, they felt that it could be applicable to other areas. And so we wanted to get away from naming these overlays with a geographic reference like the Rhino Design Overlay or the Sloan's Lake Neighborhood Conservation Overlay, because then it really confuses folks when they do want to apply it to somewhere else. So, and these titles are quite the mouthful right now. We might try to find something a little snappier, but for now they are descriptive of what they're trying to achieve.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fred.
Thanks. I just had a couple of quickie questions. One, can you give us more details on what's required when you talk about making parking floors adaptable?
Yeah. So this is something that's really new for us and exciting. Kind of looking back at Ignacio's earlier question on sort of trade-offs, what we've found within the Rhino Design Overlay, which requires that parking facades be integrated into the building design as opposed to having active uses on those floors, we found that they typically just choose to integrate the design into the building facade. And so we've added onto that the standard to make those floors adaptable, so that the base standard is kind of more on par with the alternative. And this isn't something that a lot of other cities have done, or if they have started to write it into their codes, they haven't really vetted whether or not it's working. But we did our research, and along with the recommendations of the consultant team, we've established some parameters that define those adaptable floors. And so some of those include having the floors be generally level, making sure that that adaptive use is at least 30 feet deep, and then defining the floor to floor height as a minimum of 11 feet high, maybe 12 feet.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I love the idea, and I have talked to some developers who sought to do that to a certain extent. I hope you guys are also talking to your colleagues on the building department side and fire side, just to see what else needs to be done. It'd be a shame if we did this and missed something and they weren't really adaptable because they went to the building department and the building department said, wow, no. A comment about landscape materials and landscaping materials, and that is, I do hope that we will consider at some point, and I'm not sure where this should live, but it certainly could live in the zoning code, requiring some of this landscaping to be more water wise. I think, you know, it's great to talk about this from an appearance standpoint, and I'm guessing in Cherry Creek that means that we're going to have lots of green lawns soaking up lots of water. It sure be nice to talk about it and talk about the sustainability issues and try to incorporate that into our code at some point. Just a comment. And I guess I'm a little bit concerned about the idea of the outdoor light fixtures and where that goes. You know, people are going to just put up floodlights in the alleyway and light their neighbors up too, and all of that, and requiring that. I'm just a little bit, I hope that gets kind of tuned in and narrowed in a little bit. There's some openness there that makes me a little nervous. That's all. Thanks.
No, on the lighting issue, Fred, we've certainly heard some concern even from staff that requiring lighting fixtures maybe shouldn't be a function of zoning, but this is important to the community. And there's already some other standards within our Article 10 that address kind of all our landscaping standards and lighting standards. And so per that article, light cannot shine onto like your neighbor's property or really off your zone lots.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as you know, you do an SDP and you have to show that, you know, the foot candles are below a certain level and that they don't go, you know, and so it's not a very simple thing. And I guess I worry that people are going to see that and say, well, I'm going to Home Depot. I'm going to buy that floodlight there and that'll do it in the alleyway. And, you know, it just doesn't, it's not a great path. And I'm also not totally convinced that it should be the responsibility of private landowners to light the sidewalks and the alleys. That's a whole nother question. So,
and it wouldn't be lighting anything off of their zone lot. It would just be like the areas within their setbacks.
So they
just to clarify,
so they have to light their backyard. I mean, you know, again, it's like, I don't really want to light my backyard. So anyway, it strikes me that we're starting to get a little intrusive there, but thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Heidi.
Thank you, Joel. Libby, could I get you to put that slide back up on the residential architectural overlay that is the landscaping slide?
Of course.
Thank you. So when we talk about residential design overlays, there's a couple of things that I'm really sensitive to. The first is that we have a housing crisis. And so if we're looking at increasing the amount of open space, there's a trade-off to that. We're decreasing the amount of footprint that can occur in the house. We're decreasing bedroom counts when we do that. And so what I would want to see is, how does this 60% compare to the rest of the city? Like I used to know what the statistic was a long time ago of what open space typically was on Denver lots. I know when we redeveloped Denver's former airport, we worked to reduce that, to think about affordable housing, but also about how we use our natural resources, because less housing on more land doesn't make sense from a climate change standpoint. And from that climate standpoint, what I worry about with this is the non-live landscaping material. When we use that term, non-live landscaping material, so we're going to decrease the bedroom counts and we're going to increase the open space. So we're going to have less housing and we're going to have more area that Fred was hitting on. We have a water crisis. It's a part of our climate crisis. Well, it's great to use, we absolutely need to be using material that uses less water. But when we start to talk about non-live landscaping material, what that is in my mind is artificial turf, which is backed by rubber. And we all seem to be looking towards artificial turf as the solution to not using water and climate change. But what I don't understand is, how is that impacting the heat we're creating on the street? Is that impacting actually driving climate change by warming air? So I have a lot of concerns about this. It makes me pretty nervous that it's not a beneficial thing to our city overall. And I would want to see more in-depth information on those issues that I just raised.
A couple clarifying points, Heidi. I appreciate what you said. Just wanted to note that this isn't affecting the percentages of building coverage versus open space on a zone lot. This just requires that of those open areas, that 60% has to be live planting material and 40% would be non-live planting material. So this doesn't affect the size of the building footprint at all.
Okay, so it was 50%, 50 and 50 before, and it split to 60-40.
Correct.
Is that right? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, well, good. That assuages that concern, and that I misread that. So thank you
But
for
I
that
still hear
clarification.
you. Yep, I still hear you regarding the non-live landscaping material, and we've gotten through our staff reviews, we've gotten some comments related to the landscaping standards, and this base standard comes out of Article 10, where all of our landscaping standards are. So we took that exact same language and just tweaked the percentages. But through this review, we're hearing from some other folks that we do need to kind of change our underlying landscaping standards to be more water wise and less climate impactful. So that's been a common refrain that we've heard.
Thanks for hearing me, Libby. I appreciate you.
Yep.
Thank you.
That's all, Joel.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Libby, for the presentation, and thank you for all the work that went into these guidelines. I have some background of both conversations with the community and the city staff and the consultants. So I know there was a lot of, it's been a long process. But I kind of want to continue be the voice of caution in this conversation, building on Heidi's comments. Starting with equity, who gets the design guidelines or design overlay, right? You said that this is unique scenario because the community has resources to hire a consultant, also has a local know-how about how to advocate for themselves. So there's a question of, again, who gets this special attention, what community, what neighborhood gets a design overlay versus doesn't get a design overlay. The second question is why? Why is there a desire to create an overlay? And to that point, I would say to make development more costly, I think. So there's no objective criteria that says that 5-foot setback makes a better design than no setback, or a step back at third floor or fifth floor makes a better design. But it does make design more expensive because when the structural walls don't align in a vertical plane and we start stepping them back, that makes construction significantly more expensive. I'm working on an affordable housing project right now, and we're struggling with that very issue, that it's a significant cost increase. And also there are opinions that layer cake design caused by these step backs is not necessarily better design. So again, it makes it more expensive, not necessarily better. So that's to the why of maybe making development less attainable in certain communities. And my last point is about design versus zoning, because we're using zoning to try to control design, and zoning is really not a design tool. Zoning is an entitlement tool. So when we say that somehow by applying different zoning restrictions, we're gonna create better design, I'm not convinced that that's the case. I think there are design tools, design guidelines and such. We are, I think, in Denver intentionally straying away from them, and I think that's the right approach. But I also am not convinced that using zoning to produce design outcomes is the right direction. So would welcome your response, but these are my concerns.
No, I appreciate all of your comments. As far as the equity issues, I think that's something that we need to consider on a broader, kind of a broader conversation to have, because I think that you are right that there are some communities that are capable of speaking on their behalf better than others and advocating for tools that influence design. And we're sensitive to that. And I think this addresses that partly by trying to broaden itself and not just be Cherry Creek specific, so that if there was another neighborhood that was interested in doing something like this and they wanted to just grab one of these tools and go for rezoning, they wouldn't have to spend the years that the Cherry Creek folks have spent on developing these. So hopefully they will be tools that are more broadly applicable to other neighborhoods. As far as the design overlays and whether or not kind of design belongs in our zoning code, we do have a hybrid land use and form-based zoning code. And so these design standards already exist within the underlying zone district, and these go to just kind of tweak them or enhance them in ways that achieve particular objectives. As far as the cost implications to development, the consultants on the overlays are architects, urban design professionals themselves who have worked with us to make sure that the intent of their standards are maintained and that we're working within increments that doesn't have major cost implications on the buildings. So we're trying to be cognizant of that as well, and not just picking a number out of nowhere that doesn't actually relate to the building's frame.
Okay, thank you. Jordan.
Thanks. I could be fairly brief, as a lot of what I was going to say was said before, especially by Gosha just previously. I do agree with the overall sentiment that the idea of the 0 to 5 setback, the step backs on upper levels, it's not proven, it's not guaranteed to provide better design, especially when, you know, with the DO9, where private open spaces is something that you can use to get the 0 setback. Is private open space really going to necessarily improve the quality of the public realm? I think that's, you know, kind of a nice thought. I don't know that I necessarily believe that it's the case. And kind of building on what Gosha said and the kind of the little discussion you had there at the end, if you know, related to the kind of the equity piece of that, if this were the right tool, if it did meet all the needs and it really and sole outcome, or its primary outcome, and the thing it did was to create a better public realm, more pedestrian oriented public realm, and that it is a tool that can be applied to other districts with similar, you know, needs that might not have the wherewithal to do it themselves. Why isn't this just being proposed as a tool kind of blanketing all those areas as opposed to this one very hyper specific area in Cherry Creek? You know, Cherry Creek put up the money, I guess, and the effort, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they should get to own it if it's a city policy, right? So I think that that's just a concern. I do think the intent is good. I think that there, you know, that district, from my personal experience, is not one that I spend a lot of time walking around in, primarily because I don't know anyone that lives there. But you know, there's also it's not an area that attracts me in any way. It's a block and a half from my parents' house, so theoretically I could go there, just don't. So I get the intent. I get the ideas behind it. I just, you know, to me, I don't know that I believe that it is producing a better outcome at the end of the day, since most of the sort of incentives or the improvements are meant for the people who live in the building anyway. Is it really a substantive change for the people who don't? Maybe not, but I just don't, I'm not convinced of it. I do want to, I agree with Fred on the light fixture clause. It seemed very hyper specific to me, sort of weirdly so. And also, I don't know if this was in there, but it was a provision for creating or adding light fixtures to the design in those specific areas. Is there a provision for keeping them on? Is there a way, you know, you have the light, do they have to keep it running the whole time? To me, you know, what is, you could have a light bulb and never turn it on. I don't know what the intent or how you actually police that. Oh, I'm just sort of going here, so I'll stop there, but those are some of my thoughts.
So to start with the last point, the drafters did initially want there to be like motion sensors or timers that would require the lights to be on throughout the night. And this was something that the city didn't feel like it could enforce. You know, if somebody calls the city and says, hey, it's 4 a.m. and my neighbor doesn't have their light on, can we really send somebody out there to inspect that? And what's the outcome? Councilman Hines had also said that he has heard from many of his constituents that they're concerned about light pollution. And so folks don't necessarily want a mandate that requires people to have their lights on all night long. In addition, that's really energy inefficient, right? So for a lot of different reasons, we pulled back on requiring that the lights be on. But we do feel like it's easy enough to put them on a plans and respect the neighborhood's wishes on that. But I think it's still an ongoing conversation, and we did expect at least a couple of you to bring it up. So we appreciate your concern with that. In regards to kind of why design overlays in some areas, not others, if that tool really proves to enhance the public realm, then why not just require those standards everywhere? And I think that's a conversation that we're beginning to have internally, as well as whether or not our underlying zoning districts should be tweaked so that there's just that equitable advantage available to everybody.
Thanks. Thank you. And Joe.
Thanks, Joel. I know you had your hand up first. The more I'm hearing, the more it does make me question a couple of things. The first, you said something, Libby, about that these overlays are created with specific goals in mind. And I'm just curious, where is the criteria or goal, where are they derived from? Who determines the goals? That these are...
The Cherry Creek East neighborhood, when they wanted to pursue, initially they wanted to pursue even design standards and guidelines. Okay. And that wasn't something, and so we guided them towards design overlays as a tool, and they developed their own kind of goals and intent statements for creating these two overlays. And then we've since for previous overlays that exist in the Denver zoning code today.
Okay. So I also wonder, you know,
and you're all frozen?
Can you all hear me?
Do you see me? You're all frozen. Maybe I'll cut my video for a second and see if that helps.
Yeah, good idea, Libby. I think you've been kind of having what looks on our side like bandwidth issues off and on. So yeah, thank you for giving that a try.
I thought that it was but thank you for that. The other thing, it does speak to equity when I think of how the planning folks are so stretched and how many priorities there are. I know that this one I took 2 years to get to this point, but how do you prioritize something like this? You know, in comparison to some of the other needs of communities. Libby?
Yeah. And I know we have Abe on here too, and I wonder if he could talk more generally about kind of how we evaluate all the desires to implement within our regulatory work program and how some things end up getting prioritized over others.
I don't see Abe.
Yeah, Abe had been here and he appears to not be here.
Did he pop off? But basically we've got a long list of desires that we would love to put into our annual work program that help us implement our plans. And it's just kind of every year reprioritizing sort of where we can expend staff and get the biggest bang for our buck, basically. That's kind of the shorthand of it. I've only been here for a couple of years, so that's why I was hoping Abe could kind of give you more of the institutional knowledge on how that process goes. But it is something that we definitely carefully consider and constantly reevaluate to figure out how we can help the most people.
Yeah, it looks like Abe has rejoined. Abe, you probably got the gist of that question. It was just the kind of from an equity perspective, how the work plan is set regarding staff time spent on overlays such as these.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Arch with Community Planning and Development. Sorry, my internet's probably not very good, so make a face if you can't hear me, and I'll keep video off. Regarding the equity considerations in the work program, we're certainly prioritizing the big moves coming out of adopted plans like Blueprint Denver in terms of our own resources. We have several things on the wish list in terms of doing better to have the right design tools for places like Cherry Creek East and other centers and corridors across the city. That's a big recommendation from Blueprint Denver. And I'm certainly personally hoping we can launch a project within the next year or two to like look at all of that citywide. And looking at those bigger moves is really important for all the reasons you've been talking about, because we want to make sure that everyone has access to the results that can come out of our plans. In the meantime, though, we do have this mechanism whereby an individual neighborhood, you have two today, can go through a process to have a conversation and kind of pilot some of the things that will ultimately be part of a citywide conversation.
I hear you. I'll leave it there. I just wonder, when we talk and when we have these strategic conversations, the ideas of legislative sort of not overhaul, but planning comes up, and I just wonder where that fits in discussions at the planning. But that's probably one of our retreat topics. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll ask a couple, and then I see Jordan has your hand up again. First, let me focus on the idea of these being reusable. That to do that well, I imagine takes a lot of work to test these on properties and hypothetical sites and existing sites that aren't in the area. So while you have a lot of people at the table from Cherry Creek East, if you want to name the overlay something generic with the aspiration that it can be used in more places, how much time is really being spent testing assumptions here that may or may not be true elsewhere, but were the kinds of places you thought this might be used for when you selected generic names for them?
I appreciate that comment, Joel. In this, this was a very recent evolution with the overlays in something that we haven't tested yet. And so I think if we are going to be serious about whether or not these could be applicable elsewhere, then we should consider what neighborhoods they might be applicable to, and whether or not there's a couple of tweaks that would make them, that would give them a broader appeal.
Yeah, nothing in this just brief PowerPoint level presentation has triggered any thoughts for me about, oh, well, that wouldn't work in some other area I'm more familiar with. But that did happen with the bungalow overlay in Northwest Denver. That seemed to me to be quite specific to that neighborhood and speaking to exactly how big porches should be and exactly how elevated the building should be. Not remembering the specifics in great detail, but those kinds of things that are probably not true everywhere that there's bungalows. But we aspirationally chose to name it the bungalow overlay with the idea that it might be used a lot more places. So those two were in tension, and I'm not sure I agreed that the name's generality matched how it was really tested, but it came from one area. So I have the same question here in general. I'll start with the larger buildings overlay. Taking inspiration from DO7 in Rhino, that wasn't just upper story setbacks. That was like upper story mass reduction. One of their real goals in the Rhino Art District was maintaining flexibility for architects to do creative things at the top of their building that were not just, goes up 5 stories, steps back 10 feet, but wanting to encourage creativity and flexibility. So they called it mass reduction. It seems like you're not taking that approach, but again, 1, I'm not an architect. 2, I've only seen a PowerPoint level of understanding of your direction here. How does this compare and contrast to Rhino?
And sorry if I blew through the standards too, and there was some confusion in there, but the only piece that we're borrowing from Rhino is related to the limitation on visible parking above the ground level. And so it's not meant for like shaping the building and doing the mass reduction things that Rhino was trying to do to achieve more interesting buildings. It was the only piece we borrowed from that was really to try to hide structured parking. And through either the integrated facade design that's already built into Rhino, well, it's actually, you have to do that. And then you also have to make sure that the parking structure floors are adaptable for at least a certain depth to encourage future conversion from parking to residential or commercial uses.
Okay. There are upper story setbacks if you take the alternative that doesn't have the private, publicly accessible private open space, right?
Correct.
There's a lot of new high-rise, very attractive buildings in Cherry Creek. How do those fare in with these new regulations? Could they have been built, or would they need? Again, what I worry about is kind of a prescriptive setback that ends up looking kind of forced when an architect may have come up with a beautiful building, like ones that have been built recently, that would be not possible in these regulations. Are you testing that great collection of buildings you have right on hand?
You're talking about like the newer development along Steel.
Yeah.
Yep. We have done a fair amount of testing, but I hear you there, and I think that we could probably go back and make sure that these wouldn't be constraining folks to the extent that you wouldn't get good design outcomes that we have been getting in the most recent years.
Okay, we had this discussion with Arapahoe Square. How prescriptive should a simple step back be? Abe was on that project. I see he's back on. And then the discussion in a different way came up in Rhino, and just, yes, you want to give light and air to the street, but you also want good design. So I'm glad they're architecturally minded people in here. I'm just curious where that's falling. Abe, did you care to say anything? Because you popped up on my screen as I was speaking.
Sorry, my connection is so bad. I'm going to be in a new place shortly. Hopefully we'll have a better connection. So I missed some of the conversation, but really I think it was about the difference between the flexibility of the incremental mass reduction tool versus upper story setbacks. Similar intentions behind both tools. The Rhino conversation was very much around, we want to make sure that there can really interesting things could happen, like it can be expressed as a whole through the building or something like that. I think that wasn't the conversation in Cherry Creek East. It was more just about basic access to light and air and bringing the scale of larger buildings down into a more like broken down a little bit so they're not just large boxes and have a more human scale. And because of that, the upper story setback tool is much simpler and easier to understand and more straightforward. And so that's, I think, why they went with that proposal over the incremental mass reduction that is used in River North.
Okay. I'll just be looking to, explain it to me like I'm 5, examples of how good recent buildings could or couldn't be done with these new proposals when this comes back. Then switching to the low scale residential, we talked about lighting. Let me just be clear. You're using language very carefully, Libby. It's lighting the setback, and of course, in my mind, and perhaps others, that means the walk up to the house or something. But is it, or could it be as simple as the light by the front door?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where we started, and there was some confusion about how to administer that, like exactly where by the front door does it need to be. And so we changed it to say you have to illuminate the setback area. And then within the last few days, I've wondered if that's not too extensive as well. And we need to just go back, if we're going to keep the lighting standard, and go back and just be more specific about where the fixture should be, as opposed to what area it should be illuminating. So I appreciate that comment, and I think that's something that we'll probably have to revisit as well.
Yeah, that's very designery to want to illuminate your path, and that some people want to and some people don't. And if we're talking about one alternative or one way of meeting it is the light by the front door that essentially everybody has, then I'd encourage clarity that can be all that it is. And then finally, this is a broader question. Libby, you talked about Cherry Creek East was looking at design review, and in the course of discussion, some of those things got encouraged to be in a zoning overlay instead. Is there somebody, whether it's you or somebody else on the call, who could just give us a brief regulatory history of Cherry Creek? In other contexts, I've heard, well, Cherry Creek has a design review committee and things have to go through them years ago. And then I heard, well, the city isn't honoring that anymore. It's just advisory. But now there is a design review committee, and now there's these additional layers. Can somebody just bring us up to date on what the regulatory environment is with regard to required design review and advisory design review in this area?
There is, I know there's like design review standards for Cherry Creek North, and a committee that evaluates development against standards, but there used to be some design standards and guidelines for Cherry Creek East, and then several years ago, I guess there was like a dispute as to whether or not they'd ever been adopted, and so the city wasn't going to continue to apply those to development proposals. And Cherry Creek East was interested in updating those or somehow getting them approved and applied, and we encouraged an overlay, which is just usually a lot easier to administer since it's building off of zoning code standards that already exist and are much more objective, whereas design review just takes a lot more time to go through and is a lot of more subjective kind of back and forth, not as measurable. So the overlay tools are easier for us to administer. But Abe, I don't know if you're in a clearer spot where if you want to add anything more about kind of that background.
I think that was enough for me to understand in general. So there aren't city approved, city enforced design standards and guidelines in Cherry Creek East right now.
No, so it's not like we would have underlying zoning, the design overlay, and design standard and guidelines. No, there are no design standards and guidelines.
Okay, thanks. Well, my hope is that everyone working together on this for so long gets to the point where all the PUDs we see on that map are no longer the standard every time something's built. Heidi.
Thank you, Joel. I just wanted to pick back up on a topic you had brought up about the bungalow overlay in Northwest Denver and the portability of this, of the residential code or the residential overlay that we're looking at here. Going back to that bungalow overlay district, one of the reasons that I had voted no for it was the concern on the requirement for the front porch, because the existing homes in that neighborhood, there was a pretty even split of front porch versus stoop. And Denver does have a very strong historic precedent for using type styles of architecture that utilize a stoop. So whether it's Italianate or whether it's a colonial with a front stoop, even the 1-story I guess it'd be a 2-square, has a lot of stoop to it. So to require a 6-foot deep, 48 square foot front porch becomes very architectural, becomes very stylistic in an architectural style, and quickly to me becomes inappropriate for wide scale use across the city. Thank you.
So it might be a factor that argues against the general applicability. This might be a Cherry Creek East thing, perhaps. Ignacio.
Thank you. So just a couple of final comments from my side here. I think that slide 12 or 9 in our package, the graphic needs to improve in order to convey really the idea of what can you do with the volume, because I mean what Joel was talking about, the ability to be creative is there, but you know, these are typically residential buildings, no more than 12 stories, according to the zoning, 8 and 12. So you have, these are, you know, not tall buildings that you have a lot of height to play with. So I think those two graphics are really key for the code. A comment on the floor-to-floor height on the parking convertible to residential. I think 11 is too shallow, especially when you start putting utilities under the slab and so on. I would recommend 13 feet is an optimal, maybe even in some cases 15 feet to allow for other utilities, forced air, circulation and mechanical and all that stuff. Yeah, 11 is could be not enough. And then on the DO10, you know, the lighting, obviously you're responding to the needs or the desires of the community. So that is an issue that was brought up and so on. It is weird to me. What we typically do is for large sites, we do a minimum, maximum foot candle or an average foot candle for the site and so on. You cannot do that with residential. So I would actually not even deal with it. Why putting it in zoning? But you are responding to something that the community wants. So good luck with that. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll definitely appreciate this pre-briefing. This will be coming back to us as it works its way through the process. And I hope the conversation was useful to you and your team. Thank you. And thanks,
thank you all.
Thanks to the members of the public who were here watching. We're going to move to the final item on our agenda, also an information item, also regarding an overlay. And just bringing up my PDF viewer here because it went away. Yeah, we have Brad Johnson presenting on the Sunnyside overlay. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks, Joel. Let me go through the routine here. Struggling here a little bit. Give me a moment. Are you able to see that?
Yes. And I'm going to put it into presentation mode. It looks right. Thank you.
It got big? Filled up the screen?
It's all good. Thank you.
All right, cool. All right, hi everyone. Brad Johnson, Senior City Planner and Urban Designer with CPD, presenting to you today an information item on Sunnyside Conservation Overlay. So this is a slightly different flavor of overlay than the design overlay that you just heard about. And this is a conservation overlay that's been in the works for many, many years. This would be a text amendment to create the overlay and a map amendment to apply it throughout some or all of the Sunnyside neighborhood that would be sponsored by Councilwoman Sandoval. And at the highest level of trying to describe the intent, it is that a conservation overlay is typically used to try to kind of right size the zoning with a little more surgical approach than the citywide zoning update did in 2010. to tailor the standards to some degree, design standards to respond more specifically to neighborhood patterns in a specific neighborhood, of course, in this case, Sunnyside. So just a reminder of the geography here, we're between Federal, I-70, Inca, and 38th Avenue up in District 1. And here's a zoom in map on that Sunnyside neighborhood, that same geography. And what you see in pink are single unit zoned properties, and in blue are 2-unit zone properties that would allow for duplex. And those are the 2 zone districts within the Sunnyside neighborhood that have been discussed for potential application of this overlay. There are other non-colored parcels in here that are zone commercial or other mixed use districts and such that have not been included in the discussion. And if you can imagine this overlay potentially being applied to the entirety of properties that are zoned single and 2-unit within Sunnyside, it'd be north of 3,000 properties, as you see in the little bit of data down there at the bottom right. And so Libby touched on this, but I just want to, just in case we have new folks joining, I want to reiterate this. So the idea of an overlay is that there are base zone districts that apply throughout our city. The majority of this area are all of the single unit and 2-unit properties in Sunnyside are some flavor of urban 2-unit or urban single unit. We see that zone district used through all areas of the city, many areas of the city. And so the overlay provides an opportunity for council members, neighbors, residents to come together and talk about options for how that sort of more broadly applied zone district could be tweaked to be more tailored to the conditions on the ground in a certain neighborhood. And so they can add new design standards, they can modify existing design standard, but as Libby pointed out, they cannot change the types of uses that would be allowed in a given zone district. So for example, here again, we have 2-unit and single unit district. You could not use a conservation overlay to say that only single unit buildings will be allowed, or single unit uses will be allowed in a 2-unit zoned area of the city, or vice versa. Just want to point out some blueprint guidance. So when we look into that document, there's specific language here on the screen that advocates for the use of this tool in areas that have distinctive feature or distinctive neighborhood patterns. We have also criteria in the zoning code that says before we apply a conservation overlay to an area, we need to meet the criteria. The area needs to have a consistent set of characteristics that the overlay provisions are responsive to. So if you spend some time, I'm sure many of you have spent time in Sunnyside, and I've been fortunate enough to spend some time out there recently as part of this work. And as you go throughout the neighborhood from east to west, I think you will see that there's actually a lot of variety out there. You're going to see single unit houses, you can see duplexes, you see a mix of kind of smaller multi-unit properties mixed in, like this picture on the top left. You're only seeing 2 doors there, but I think there are maybe 4 on this building, if I recall correctly. So there's a lot of variety, but within that variety, there's a lot of consistency, right? And so if you look at the kind of traditional buildings, let's say buildings that were constructed, 19 kind of mid-century stuff and before, which is most of it out there, the original properties, you're going to see a lot of 1 to 2 story buildings. Typically, you're going to see pitched roof. There are some exceptions to that in older buildings. Most of the footprints are fairly narrow and modest in size overall. You will see a first story element, whether it's a stoop or a porch, on the majority of the buildings out in Sunnyside. I think porches are far and away probably the most common type, but certainly there are stoops and other types of kind of first story elements out there. Many of them project from the front wall of a building. You will see also the first floor or the street level story, to use kind of more zoning terminology, is typically raised off of the adjacent grade. Again, looking at the picture on the left here, you see that in action. And then in terms of building materials, again, a variety to be sure, but the most common material you'll see throughout the neighborhood, and I think the numbers bear this out, is brick cladding. And so I mentioned the neighborhood council district has been working on this for many, many years. This work was going on even before Councilwoman Sandoval came into office. So back when Councilman Espinoza was the council rep up there. And this is some of the analysis I think that the neighborhood and council district worked on. So you are seeing here kind of in the middle, a lot of what we're seeing, particularly in the 2-unit zoned areas, which is a building that is built to maximize the bulk plane. And so here you see a 2-unit duplex building with that 3rd story sort of set back from the edges to get within the height of the bulk plane and those angles there. And then to the left, you see a couple of building forms that are out there in the neighborhood for sure, but perhaps are a little less prevalent. And then to the right, I think you see more of the typical traditional form that you would see out there. And so from all this analysis and discussion that the neighbors have undertaken and in coordination with the council district and also with us, that analysis led to and discussion led to a series of design standards that are in kind of draft form right now. We've got an internal draft that we're working on with the council and the neighborhood working group. And these are kind of some components of the draft intent statements. So again, speaking to the kind of trying to push on the key elements, so not the whole laundry list of everything that might be done in a conservation overlay, but the kind of fundamental for the most part, massing and scale elements, and trying to push for a more context-sensitive outcomes through those elements. So now I'll walk through the specific elements, and you guys will probably recognize a lot of these from the bungalow overlay. Many of them were taken from that, or even previous overlays or elements of our zoning code that were modified for this, or some of them came over just as they are in the bungalow overlay. So starting in the kind of scale and massing category, we look at the draft zoning overlay that we're considering here. It would reduce the building height in feet for sloped roof structures from 30 to 35. You can get 35 if you have a wider lot, down to 30. So just a flat cap of 30 regardless of the width of the lot. So it's pretty incremental change there. A little more significant change for low slope roofs, which are, you can see defined there down based on a 312 pitch, but it's basically a flat roof or an almost flat low pitched roof, from 30 to 35 feet down to 22 feet. Again, from a similar approach to what you saw in bungalow, the upper surface of the floor of that street level requiring a minimum of 12 inches above the base plane, or roughly above grade around the front of the building, to a maximum of 36 inches, but putting in some flexibility into the zoning language so that DOTI could potentially respond to issues related to flooding or whatever else might come up on a case-by-case basis. So this kind of photo on the far right that shows the building kind of right on the grade would not be allowed without that exception from DOTI under this overlay. And that's to try to keep that kind of key character defining feature of that raised first floor and front porch in new development that might come on board. Continuing on scale and massing, we've got a bulk plane adjustment, which is to reduce the vertical height at side zone lot line to 14 from 17. So you guys will remember, I'm hoping you can see my mouse. The bulk plane is essentially the envelope in which a building can be built. And part of what defines that envelope is a vertical line that comes up from the side zone lot line. And then from the top of that imaginary line, it goes up at a 45-degree angle to the top of the bulk plane. So right now, the distance of this line before it takes that kink up at 45 degrees is 17. And so this would be an incremental reduction down to 14. It would accept dormers that meet certain criteria, so they could pierce this bulk plane area if they are of a certain size and set back from the front wall and other kind of criteria like that. Again, something else that came over from Bungalow would be a max on square footage of 3,000 square feet for a lot 7,500 square feet or less, and then allowing for additional flexibility for larger lots, which there are certainly some out here. The intent is that that square footage cap of 3,000 would only apply to the primary structure, would only apply to above grade floor area, so not to a basement, for example, and would only apply to the urban house building form. So this type of square footage cap would not, as currently drafted, apply to a duplex form or a tandem house form. I mentioned the prevalence of kind of first story elements or front porches that you see out in the neighborhood. So this overlay would, as it's conceived, put in a front porch requirement that would have requirements for size, in terms of area, depth, as some was mentioned in the previous item, and then some other criteria for design that also kind of comes along over from the Bungalow overlay. I will note that this square footage requirement of 90, that's the current number. Maybe it could be a little bit lower or higher, but that's the one we're working with right now, is lower than what was in the Bungalow overlay. And then I think this is the last one, building materials. So I mentioned the prevalence of brick out in the neighborhood. This has been a much discussed topic in the neighborhood. This is a little bit new for Denver. This is not something that was included in the Bungalow overlay, but the concept of this requirement would be that for certain elevations of a building, that they would require minimum percentage of those elevations or exterior walls of an elevation to be of brick cladding. And the intent behind this also is to focus on walls that are most visible from the street. And so try to describe this a little bit. So street facing walls and side walls are the types of walls that this this brick requirement would apply to. It would only apply to the front 65% of the zone lot. It would only apply to the primary structure. And the concept is that would only apply to new development. So if you wanted to do an addition above your first floor or a rear addition or anything like that, it would not, this requirement would not kick in. Looking at this diagram just for a minute, so this is all a plan view diagram. Here's the primary street, here's the side street and the alley up at the top of this diagram. And I want to start with, I'll start here with just the very simple kind of rectangle shape. And these are percentages of requirement of brick cladding that would potentially be applied through this overlay to these different wall types. So this 60 is saying that 60% of the exterior surface of a street facing wall, whether it's, must be clad with brick. And that a side wall like this one or this one over here could be a reduced percentage down to 40%. And that of truly rear facing wall, such as this one here, would have no brick requirement at all. And then we can come back to this, but there's some nuance. Obviously, you know, it's easier to explain in the perfect rectangle, but we have to think through in drafting a rule like this, how it would apply to non-rectangular shaped buildings or buildings with shifts in the massing and offsets and things like that. So that's what that's trying to demonstrate to the left and right of the middle. And so with that, I'll leave this
this on the screen for a moment, but I know either Councilwoman Sandoval or Naomi Grunitz from her office is here, and I think would like to say a few words before we get into discussion and questions.
Absolutely. Welcome, Councilwoman Sandoval.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you, planning board members, for taking time out of your day for this really important conversation. One key point regarding the overlay is what we have been talking about in Sunnyside is this proposal will create modest but meaningful change in the massing and the appearance of new development. And that key theme of creating modest but meaningful change in the massing and the appearance of new development has been key to what we've been talking about in Northwest Denver. I think it was really important on the last overlay of why do we have these overlays? What is the point of the overlays? The point of our overlays is Denver has a form-based and design hybrid. It's not just form-based, it's a hybrid type of zoning code that we have. And since 2010, there has not been any updates to any of the TU zone districts or the single family zone districts. And in Sunnyside, as redevelopment has occurred, we've seen it rampant in the TU zone districts. And so that is what the intent of the overlay is, modest changes to the built environment. And we have taken a lot of these solutions, what we're calling them, from the bungalow overlay, but they all started, a lot of them started with the Potter Highland Conservation Overlay in Potter Highland. And that is in a 2-unit zone district and passed in 2015, which I worked on with Councilman Montero. Another key point that I'd like just to talk about is besides the outreach that my office has done with the help of Naomi and the Sunnyside Working Group through their planning and community development, is we're also in the Near Northwest Neighborhood Plan. And the first reports from that Near Northwest Neighborhood Plan have come out and they're online. And if after this briefing, if you would take a moment to read some of those reports that are online for the Near Northwest Neighborhood Plan, the NPI, it also sets the stage for this overlay. And in Sunnyside, we have modest homes that are being taken and bought and being redeveloped and being maxed out. And we are no longer able to keep affordable housing in Northwest Denver. In one of the reports from the Near Northwest Plan, it talks about the fact that the city and county of Denver doesn't track naturally occurring affordable housing. And what it talks about is that because there are typically cheaper to buy these naturally occurring affordable housing, the forms that are coming and the masses the mass and the bulk that is being created displaces existing residents. A new development that replaces these homes maximizes square footage and rises land value. And one of the things that is interesting in the Near Northwest Plan document that has come out, their first report, is that Sunnyside is one of the areas where we have higher home ownership of Hispanic and residents. And we want to keep that in this neighborhood. And so once again, I will just go back to what I and what the working group, the residents of Sunnyside, who I have the honor and privilege of representing, have been saying, that this proposal will create modest but meaningful change in the massing and appearance of new development. And with that, I'll just sit back, and if you have questions that Brad can't answer, I'm happy to chime in, but I'll let Brad take it from here. But just it's been definitely a partnership. I got sworn in July of 2019, and this had been going on for years prior. I'd worked for my predecessor. And so this has definitely been a big partnership with CPD and Brad and Abe for years through COVID and through lots of trials and tribulations through the city. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, questions and comments. I have Angel, Heidi, and Fred. Angel.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Brad. Thank you, Councilwoman Sandoval. I guess this could be for either of you, but I'm curious about the anticipated sort of scope of this, like how much land is developable in Sunnyside, and do these conservation overlay requirements, are they the same for new developments as redevelopments? Just trying to understand how much this applies to in Sunnyside.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how much developable land is, I think that's going to be a really hard one to answer because, you know, like vacant land, there's probably almost none.
Right.
Buildings that are, you know, in danger of being torn down and a building going in their place, probably many. Hopefully not any percentage beyond, you know, it's still a small number in the scope probably, I think, that are in direct danger of this in the scope of the entire neighborhood. But I think I mean, this is a big neighborhood, you know, there are 3,000 some odd properties we mentioned there. And so certainly there are many of them that could be in danger of that type of change.
Has that been a trend that you've seen, sort of demolition and redevelopment?
Well, and I know I want to also invite the councilwoman to or her staff to weigh in here, but our understanding based on their research is that the majority of the building activity has happened in the TU zone districts. And I don't have data for this, maybe they do, but I would suspect many of those involved demolition of the building.
That's correct. Most of the redevelopment in the Sunnyside neighborhood has happened in the 2-unit area, and that's where we've seen the mass, but also it's happened in the single unit area. And to answer one of your points, this is for new construction. So this is, you take an old 1934 bungalow and you scrape it, and then you redevelop it in your place. And this is when these solutions trigger. It wouldn't be if I wanted to add an addition to my kitchen. The one thing that I do think would trigger is, right now, you have to go to the Board of Adjustment to have a dormer. Dormers are no longer allowed. So if you want to pop your top and do a modest pop top, you are not allowed to do that. You have to go to the Board of Adjustment. And this zoning, this overlay would allow dormers so that we can make people staying in their house and have smaller additions as your family grows, that stay within the scale and actually keep costs down. I hope that answered part of your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Councilwoman. So it sounds like you and your constituents view this overlay district as an anti-displacement tool. And I think you may have just touched on it with being able to allow one-story units to pop their top and keep people in place. Is that an accurate assessment?
It is an accurate assessment to be able to keep the modest housing that we have in Northwest Denver. And as you have a family, be able to expand it, but in a modest way that's affordable.
Okay. Do the other components of this overlay district, do you and your constituents also view as an anti-displacement tool? The brick requirements, the front porch requirements, the finished floor height requirements, do you view that those will prevent scrapes?
So we believe that the maximum square footage, because the market is driven by square footage and how big a square foot home is, that would also be an anti-displacement tool so that people can have smaller homes, because the bigger the house, the more expensive it is. As for the porches, that's more of a Denver theme, especially in Sunnyside, of it being one of Denver's original neighborhoods. We have porches. And I would say that probably during COVID, We explored our porches and what they could be used for more than any time ever. People who are in smaller homes found respite on their front porches. And also it's a tool to make sure that we have a neighborhood watch. So people usually there's lots of neighborhood watches in my neighborhood and all throughout District 1. And people use their porches to communicate and talk and sit on. So I don't think that's an anti-displacement tool. I think it's a community building tool from what I have heard from my constituents. As for the brick requirement, that's why we don't have a map of the exact area, because some of the areas don't have brick. And that is a conversation that we're having right now. Should we be mandating brick in areas that don't have brick, like post-World War II homes? We have areas like that. And so that's a discussion that we're having further, because we don't want to have that cause more displacement. And we don't want that to cause more gentrification and say, oh, this overlay requirement is so restrictive that it'd be easier to scrape, because that's often what happens in Northwest Denver. Is it's easier to scrape and start new than to use an older structure and adaptively reuse it because our code is so rigid. So no, not on that one necessarily. And I couldn't remember the last one that you asked me.
It was just the brick, the front porches, and then the finished floor height was the third one.
The finished floor height, no, that one isn't getting to the anti-displacement. That's more of looking at the built environment, and it's preserving the sense of place that we have in Sunnyside. And we've had a lot of conversation when this overlay first took place. It was massive, as I'm sure Brad can talk about. It probably had lots of different solutions. And so we have narrowed this down to be as simplistic as possible. But that one is just preserving the place and making sure that we understand that this is one of Denver's original neighborhoods.
Right. Thank you for all of that, Councilwoman. I appreciate it. When you're talking about being able to keep existing structures and reuse them and prevent the scrapes, I did notice in some of those pictures that there were homes that have a front stoop. Would you be willing to add any kind of language into this that allows for a front stoop? So those houses that do have them, if they wanted to alter, they wouldn't be put into a position of having to build a front porch?
I would be open to suggestions like that. That's why I think it's so important that we are here in front of you. And if you could provide us with what you think the dimensions are for a good stoop to be usable, we're absolutely open to having that conversation.
I don't think that's going to be my area expertise, Councilwoman, to provide the exact size of a stoop based on the houses in the neighborhood. I think that's probably more appropriate coming from the community and architects within the community that know that housing stock better than I do. So I thank you for asking for my input, and we'll defer to the community on those front stoops. And then just my last comment, Councilwoman, would be the concern about government making homes less accessible to people who have less mobility than a fully able-bodied person. So the one home that I did see not allowed on one of those slides was a universal entry, and I looked at that and said, hey, somebody who needs to use a wheelchair to get around could get into that house. And so that's just the one. I understand preserving the character that everything's kind of bumped up, but there's also got to be a place for everybody in our neighborhoods, and including those who need to use a wheelchair to get around. I'd ask you to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you. The queue as I have it is Fred, Gosha, and then myself. Fred.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi, for bringing the mobility question up. I have to say that was one of the, to me, most, I guess, disturbing elements of this is that, essentially you're mandating houses that say folks who need to use wheelchairs really aren't welcome to move to this neighborhood. And I think in terms of people trying to purchase houses that they can age in place in and really stay in a neighborhood for a long time, 12 inches up above grade means a 12-foot ramp to access your house. And again, I'm not sure how compatible that ends up being with the porch requirement. So I really would encourage you guys to maybe spend some time with the folks at the city who specialize in mobility and access and ADA to see how this might relate to that. When we talk about this being one of Denver's original neighborhoods, at that time, I don't think we cared so much about people who had mobility issues. They weren't really expected to leave the house. And I think that has changed. So I really encourage you to look at that. I'd love to see, because I understand the point of trying to prevent houses being taken down, but where that does happen, I'd love to understand a little bit better when this comes forward, the viability of duplexes in the TU zone with the changes that are proposed in terms of bulk plane. Is that still then going to be a viable form, or has the overlay essentially created an SU district out of a TU district? Because I think that's an important one. When we talk about affordability, we still have a shortage of units. So I think that's an important issue. And then finally, again, when we talk about affordability, I believe the brick requirement is kind of onerous, to be honest. Houses were built out of brick because that was a structural material, and now it's a facing, it's a facade. And there are certainly other less expensive, just as durable materials out there that architects are using in interesting ways. And I think to limit that makes sure that those houses are going to be expensive, or at least more expensive than they maybe need to be. And I think also, as we look at historic preservation guidelines, we don't want to mimic, we don't want nostalgia in our buildings. And so by limiting that, it concerns me that we really are limiting the scope of what can be made, in a sense. So thank you.
Yeah, I would just say that we've modeled for the TU, because I understand that same concern. I'm not attempting to make a 2-unit zone district into a single unit zone district at all. So we did actually more modeling in the TU zone district so that we understood that this would apply in it. And we have 2 architects who work in this neighborhood and also live in this neighborhood who have been very adamant that we allow duplex zoning to continue to be 2-unit zoning, exactly what it is. And so this model, and we've done a lot of modeling to make that sure, but I will for sure keep that in mind and I know that my constituents are watching as well to get feedback and comments from all of you on your other thoughts that you've had. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ignacio, Gosha, and myself.
Thank you. Thank you. Hey, Brad, I have a couple questions here. Let's see. Slide, I think it's 12. Yeah, slide 12 and 11. You don't have to put them up, but what we're talking about is the base plane. So the base plane is where you start measuring the height of the building. So on the single family, sorry, on the pitch roof, you have 30 feet now. Where do you start measuring? You start measuring from the base plane or from the stoop height, from the finished floor level?
As it's drafted, it'd be from the front base plane. As you know, probably you'll recall, like in these kind of single unit zones, there's like a front base plane and a rear base plane. So the way we've got it set up in Bungalow, and the current intention is to do the same, as it would be measured from the front base plane.
Okay, so if you have a porch that is the maximum, which is 36 inches, then you are already 2 feet shorter than the alternative, right?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. All right. And, that goes a little bit to what Fred was talking about, the ADA and accessibility, but I am not as concerned about that because even if you're at the front and you cannot put a ramp there, you still have a back and you still have a way to gain that height through the length of the lot. So that's it. Now on the low slope, which I actually like to call a shallow slope because there's no really low slope. The 22 foot, again, the same thing. The base plane is what we just discussed. So you are going to end up with a shorter building. Like the comment I had on the parking to residential on the previous overlay, I think that you should go a little bit higher, maybe give it 13 feet for 2 stories and so on. And also define at which point it becomes a shallow slope, right? I think it is defined somewhere. I don't know if it's in chapter 13 of the code, but there is a definition at which point you become a shallow slope. Okay.
Yep. I'm just going to put it up here for you to remind you. So it's a 312 pitch or less is a low slope.
Correct.
Roof
Yeah.
is defined. Yeah.
So you see, if you have a 22 and you start from the base plane at 36, now you are 3 feet less than that. That's 19 for 2 stories. It's getting a little bit squat, but I like the idea that the flat roof buildings need to be on a different rule, right? I like the idea of the dormer. And let's talk about the openings. The brick. Is the brick the 60% of the brick? Are you counting the windows and doors, the openings, as part of that 60%, or?
Yeah, as we've drafted it, they are not part of the calculation. So because we talked about this with the neighborhood did not want to put in a rule that would discourage windows, right? And so when we look around the country at other brick requirements, typically what we saw was that the window area or also doors were typically excluded from that definition. So if you took an elevation, a wall that had a bunch of windows, you'd subtract the area of the windows from the calculation, and then you take whatever was remaining that was an exterior wall, and that would be used for the percentage.
Okay, thanks. And then talking about brick as a material, I've seen not too many, but there are several buildings that maybe were brick but are now stucco, and they have been stucco for a while. And I don't know. I think that you should give it a little bit of thought about what is the role of stucco there. We can do. I mean, so I guess talking about the cost of materials and so on, we're talking about new buildings. So the cost of brick, is that an equitable thing for a new building in order to? This starts becoming, in a way, a deterrent for McMansions, and I think that it is, in a way, a good strategy to require this kind of material, because what we're trying to do here is to preserve mostly the existing buildings. So I'm going to stop there. Keep on going. Thank you very much.
Do you mind, would it be okay, Joel, if I just made a couple comments on the accessibility questions?
Yeah, please do.
Or comments. So I know, Fred, I don't think you were on planning board yet when we came last year with the bungalow overlay. I think they're fair concerns, and I think we've talked about them a lot with the neighborhood. I just wanted to point out a couple of things that didn't show up in the slide, which were that we did in Bungalow, and that I think we intend to do here, is that we built in additional flexibility for ramps. We made it so that this requirement for a raised first floor only be applicable to the front 40% of the zone lot. Is it as flexible as no rule at all? No, but we did take some steps to try to create flexibility that didn't exist in the code now for where ramps can go and such. And I don't want to speak too much, but I know Naomi Grunditz with the council office did reach out to some folks in the city that specialize in accessibility and may be able to comment on those discussions.
Yeah, I'd welcome any more background on that, and you might want to stop sharing your screen because you're showing the Zoom itself, which is recursive.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know.
And if we want to promote Naomi, she's certainly welcome to present, or a councilwoman, if you'd like to comment on that.
Yes, so when we were bringing forward the bungalow overlay, we met with Human Rights and Community Partnerships, has their mobility. And so we met with them, Dr. Aisha Russo, and unfortunately there was no guidance, because in single family and homes like this, it's not required to have ADA. And so it's really important for all of us to think about aging in place. And it's really important for us to think about making sure we have homes that are accessible to everybody. Just this week, I was at Chaffee Park, which is within the Sunnyside neighborhood, and a father who is a paraplegic donated backstops and backboards and 2 new so that people at Chaffee Park could actually play basketball, because they were so worn out. And so I play basketball with somebody in a wheelchair just this week with Denver Parks Trust. So it's absolutely at the forefront of our conversation. But unfortunately, all the people that Naomi and I met with, they didn't really have any guidance other than that aging in place would be great, but it's not mandated within these zone districts that we're looking at.
Yeah, no, it sounds like the conversation that's being invited here is not about what's mandated, but making existing ability to make things accessible harder to do. So even if it might not be mandated today, there's a certain ability for people to build things in a way that's accessible that this might be working against. I think that's the framing that I'm hearing. And if Naomi Grunditz, who is on, cared to speak, you could raise your hand and we'll certainly promote you. Next, I see Gosha.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I agree with some of the technical or all of the technical concerns, accessibility. Yeah, not so much mandating accessibility, but not mandating inaccessibility, I think is the concern that we're pointing at. Now, personally, I just had a foot surgery 5 weeks ago. So for somebody who started to walk Denver, not being able to walk has been very humbling learning experience, and definitely can sympathize with, the couple steps that would be mandated in a design if they could be avoided. I also shared Fred's concern about the duplex. I think with the bulk height limitation, we're looking at a 1-story duplex. So that may not be feasible. But I wanted to talk about different concerns, and I really appreciate Councilwoman bringing this topic to us and working on it. I know this is not the first overlay, and I think we're kind of going through these conversations and considering different issues, and I see both sides. So, I see development going in Sunny side, and $400,000 single family homes being scraped and replaced with a duplex that sells for $1.5 million for each side. And also these duplexes are not only large, but they're designed in modern Scandinavian style or modern farmhouse style. And I wonder, you know, where's the context? How are they context sensitive to our kind of cultural design qualities and the character of neighborhood? So I definitely feel it and recognize it and maybe even live it in my professional life and struggle with it as architect and as a resident of Denver. On the flip side, I want to kind of pose the similar questions as I did in the prior discussions about who is it for and to what end? Because we don't see design overlays or conservation overlays like this in Barnum, where there's similar housing stock in the sense that they are mostly single story buildings and large families and large percentage of Hispanic home ownership, and we would like to preserve that home ownership there, but we don't see it there. We see it in Sunnyside, and to what end it is to prevent development and push development or redevelopment somewhere else to communities that don't have resources to request and implement overlay like that. So I do have these equity concerns, because if we are talking about preventing displacement and gentrification, then we should be really thinking more comprehensive way and really looking at neighborhoods that are at risk of being displaced and falling